Elden Ring is the big one. Admittedly, I've been a bit terrified to tackle this game's bosses because of how large and complex and the amount of mechanical depth that is in this game. It's astounding, really. Elden Ring's bosses aren't perfect, that's obvious. You can't have a game that's this size and expect every single boss to reach the peaks of some of From Software's past work. But that doesn't mean that this game isn't filled with some excellent enemies to fight with movesets that leave your jaw on the floor. And, oddly enough, Elden Ring is the first game in this video series where I have had to define what a boss is, which wasn't easy. I ultimately knew that whatever decision I made wouldn't please everyone. I was thinking about only doing Runebearer bosses, then I thought about only doing Remembrance bosses, but I ultimately found this really excellent guide made by Boss Fight Database that supplied me with every boss in the game. Thank you for that, Boss Fight Database. This video wouldn't have been possible without that wonderful guide. Thank you again. So every single boss that is included in that video will also be included in my video. Thank you for joining me, and let's end this video series off with the big boss roster that is the Elden Ring. No doubt, first impressions matter a lot, and Elden Ring's first impression is, it's a lot. There's a lot to take in here, whether that be the beauty of the world that you will inevitably explore, or an enemy with a seemingly complex moveset. How someone may feel, though, will vary, but I was blown away. Sekiro players will feel at home, as the introduction to this game and Sekiro are almost identical. Elden Ring flashes its beauty and values brevity with its introduction, because if you really want to, you can start exploring the lands between a mere few minutes after you initially boot up the game. I think both Sekiro and Elden Ring took the correct approach with both of their respective games. Sekiro has a higher skill floor, meaning a slightly longer tutorial is going to go a long way for most players, while Elden Ring's skill floor simply is not as high. Like in both of these games, you are not expected to beat the boss that you initially come across. And to continue with the theme of similarity that these two share, you will eventually meet both of these enemies again, so you can prove that Genichiro and the Grafted Scion are beneath you. That's how I look at the Grafted Scion, at least. While some may look at the Grafted Scion as the first sign of the bad in Elden Ring. Elden Ring is no doubt a large freaking game. It's the largest game FromSoft has made by a mile. Some people think that Elden Ring was almost too big, and that led to issues that some levy towards this game, mainly with the amount of reuse. Reuse will, no doubt, be talked about in this video. How you and I view the downsides that comes with the open world, which is for the most part the reused enemies and bosses, may be where our opinions do not align. But I must say, I like the Grafted Scion. I think he's well done, and looks the part as the first enemy you will see in the entire game, dude. Yes, the Soldier of Godrick does exist, and yes, it is a basic enemy with a health bar and nothing more. Even beginner players shouldn't really have much issue with this boss, as he has very little poise and overall stats. What makes him interesting, however, is how he is in the tutorial itself. Elden Ring's tutorial is quite interesting, and just like Bloodborne's notes that reside in the Hunter's Dream, it's kind of hidden. From Software even had to add an NPC post-launch that nudges you to jump downwards so players can actually understand that the tutorial exists. I guess that's the more interesting topic with this boss. He's so tucked away that some people completely missed his entire existence. And with how large and expansive Elden Ring is, it was bound to bring in a lot of new players. And new players can use that tutorial as it teaches you a lot of useful things. So is the Soldier of Godrick a good fight? Absolutely not. You will fight him 100 times in the open world. But I think he does a good enough job at letting the players not have a strenuous situation they are placed in, and they can practice the jump attacks, the reflects, whatever they want really, without the weight of what a challenging boss brings to the table. Something that I really enjoy with Elden Ring and other open world games such as Breath of the Wild and Breath of the Wild's DLC, Tears of the Kingdom, are catacombs. I am going to try and not unleash the whole catacomb discussion on my first go around, but I do enjoy them more than the average player. They are a welcome checkpoint to spend your runes, and whatever extrinsic rewards I get at the end doesn't really matter that much to me. It's always nice for me to find these catacombs as a welcome break from the open world, and they allow me to experience something a little bit more focused. Honestly, I like Breath of the Wild shrines a lot more than Elden Ring's catacombs. We'll get more into that at a later point in the video. What I will say is that the starting catacombs are an interesting case study because of what they will throw at you. At this point in the game, you're not aware that all of these enemies will be reused throughout the game multiple times. So, seeing these new mobs inside a catacomb was always a fun experience for me personally. And just like in Breath of the Wild, the initial catacombs test you on skills that you will learn and utilize throughout your journey within the lands between. And this is why I have nothing but positivity for our initial few catacombs. What the Watchdogs exemplify is delayed snap attacks that we saw a lot in Elden Ring as a whole. Elden Ring and From Software pushed the Souls combat system further than what most expected, and when you are pushing something, you are stressing its potential to new limits. Did the other games have delayed attacks? Absolutely, but Elden Ring introduced what felt like a lot of them. For some, these delayed attacks weren't annoying at first, but the longer the game went on, the more the annoyance emerged. But for me personally, I usually don't have an issue with these delayed attacks that our Watchdog is so fond of. I actually enjoy the process of memorizing the snap timing and dodging based on the metronome that I have set in my head. There's a reward in that for me personally. It's part of why I play the Souls games. The trial and error of getting hit by this and then not getting hit is part of the high and the dopamine that Souls games induce. I love it. Now, he's not all delay and no bite. He does have a few ranged moves with his Fire Breath to give him that needed moveset variety that makes him more than a one-trick pony that only does delayed attacks. I like him a lot, and if you ask me, this Catacomb boss here is better than the average Dark Souls 3 and Dark Souls 1 boss and enemy. I actually went back and viewed every Dark Souls 1 boss, and it's a lot better than most of the bosses in that game. Some of you may be saying, well duh, From Software better be making better enemies this far into their craft, and while I don't disagree with your statement, let's not forget this is a Catacomb enemy. A high quality Catacomb boss, but alas, a Catacomb boss. And if he is this good, this early into the game, then any fan of Souls was probably overwhelmed with exuberant emotions because of how far one of their favorite franchises has come. So, I'm going to come out and say it, the Watchdog is one of the best Catacomb enemies in the entirety of Elden Ring. And since I just got off of Sekiro, I was really starting to miss two things. For one, I was really missing a big goddamn sword. I am a tried and true strength player. I would die for my fellow strength enjoyers, and we are superior to dex users. But I was also missing fighting multiple enemies without becoming frustrated. I like fighting multiple enemies in groups. Dual bosses are one thing, but having basic mob enemies attack you from various angles while I spam the circle button is a gameplay variation that I don't think many enjoy. I get it. 1v1ing bosses is cool, never gets old, but finding opportune times is a skill that I enjoy. I also enjoy the tactical approach I take with these fights, and that is choosing to take out the smaller enemies first. Then I focus on the big guys. And that's what the Demi-human Chiefs are trying to reinforce. How can you handle a multitude of enemies that are ganging up on you? And if you do miss this catacomb, the area leading up to Stormveil Castle will surely reinforce this idea. This catacomb is what new players would probably view as a burden, since these new players are not well equipped at managing their camera and dealing with multiple enemies simultaneously. I guess this catacomb may be yet another victim to the camera in the Souls games. I would place no fault on a new player for locking onto one of the mobs in this catacomb and becoming frustrated with the camera. Although, FromSoft knows their camera and their games 100 times better than I ever could, so maybe the camera isn't a big issue and new players can handle fighting multiple enemies just fine. I do think that the Demi-human Chiefs are the weakest catacomb enemies that are in the starting area that is Limgrave, but they're okay. The starting catacombs are, from memory at least, some of the better catacombs in Elden Ring's base game. The Beastman of Farum Azula is what I would call a pristine example of why catacombs are better than Chalice dungeons in every way. This catacomb is short and to the point. The catacomb preceding him isn't good. I wouldn't be surprised if it was put together in a matter of minutes. There's a few wolves to deal with and that's kind of it. There's practically nothing here. And the Beastman isn't something to write home about either. He's not as mechanically interesting compared to what we've seen prior, yet he still feels better than most Chalice dungeon bosses. Still, you can jump attack him to death, which will negate the few mechanics he has, and you can promptly leave the catacomb as your first Elden Ring disappointment. Why this catacomb is better than Chalice dungeons is because it's so short and offers that nice break from the open world. You spend your runes, but you also get what is most likely your first talisman, which negates fire damage for Agheel. This reward wasn't hard to find, it wasn't annoying to do, and I kind of don't hate it. The Beastman himself, well, he's not that interesting. His weapon is so short and stubby that simply walking away from him while he does his attacks is enough to do the trick. There isn't much dodging that you need to do here, and I think that's fine. This is great for beginners, and getting your first ring is something that's good for everyone. The Mad Pumpkinhead has the fun gimmick where part of his body cannot be damaged, and your damage will be negated if you hit him on the wrong part of his body. I like little things like this. I just wish there was more of a challenge here. The gimmick of forcing players to reposition themselves for proper attacks is a neat way to force some gameplay variety. It's just a shame that some of Elden Ring's bigger weaknesses is that we got a lot of mechanically interesting main bosses, but few bosses that try something a little bit different and are still interesting. Pretty much every boss is a two-phase mechanical fight. I am not saying that we should return to the ways of the old and Demon Souls bosses should be the norm, but some little nuances like this are always fun. Horse combat may be the counter argument here, and we'll talk about that as the video goes on. I still think that he deserves a lot of credit for being an AI that's more complex than most of the enemies we would see from the older games. I think that From Software could have even buffed his stats since he's kind of hidden and tucked away in an easy to miss location. Plus, he is guarding an NPC that sells magic, making the reward that much more desirable for eager magic users. The Stonedigger Troll may be our first interaction with real camera issues in Elden Ring. It didn't take long, to no one's surprise, but here we are. Everyone will have different thoughts on how the camera works in these games, and honestly, if I wasn't dissecting these bosses, I wouldn't complain about the camera that much. The Stonedigger Troll is a slow, hard-hitting brute, and any experienced Souls player can beat him on their first try. But when you go into boss fights with the goal of analyzing their strengths and weaknesses, you will have a different outlook on certain things within the game. A large enemy such as the Demon of Hatred or the Guardian Ape had their camera zoomed out to fit their massive size. From Software was able to design something they thought worked for Sekiro, and players got a great boss in return. But here, we have an enemy where melee players will only be able to see half of his body, and that may be frustrating for some. Sometimes the troll will raise his weapon, and seeing it come down feels impossible when you are attacking his feet. If you consider that a problem, or how drastic this problem is, will vary from person to person. Honestly, as I said earlier, with how easy this guy is to put down, I can live with it. For an enemy that is a large brute, I don't think the troll is unsuccessful. He does have a more interesting moveset to fight than something like the last giant in Dark Souls 2, so that might put things into perspective. And when I judge it like that, I have a lot of respect for our troll. Is the ring he drops god fucking awful? Absolutely. It 100% is. But the rewards inside the cave were good enough. If there's one thing that Elden Ring does better than every other Souls game besides Sekiro, it's designing good enemies and reusing them an absolute fuckton. The Cemetery Shade is a great example of a good enemy design that goes underappreciated by most. Something that Sekiro exemplified is that From Software designs high-quality assets and reuses them a lot. This is, of course, a double-edged sword. You can have entirely unique assets in Elden Ring, where each enemy is used once or twice, or you can have almost every enemy used multiple times, but they are a high-quality asset. None of these are perfect, but what is, really? Because I think that the Cemetery Shade is pretty fucking awesome for what it is. And if Catacombs have one major flaw, it's that they are too easy. I know they are meant to be a nice pit stop away from the open world, but most catacombs don't require much thought, and going into a catacomb and slaughtering every enemy in sight is not a fun experience, and it's not in line with what I would expect from a From Software game. And the most catacombs in Elden Ring are piss easy, brain off, and the only catacombs that required me to rub together 2 brain cells are the ones that are located in Shadow of the Erdtree. I never saw the Cemetery Shade's moveset. I walked up to it, pushed R1 as quickly as possible, and it died before I was able to see what was going on. But when you force yourself to interact with the Shade's moveset, it has some interesting design elements I would like to call out. For one, when you are treating this enemy as an equal, and just to be clear, this enemy is not equal to the player, as most people will come here overleveled, even for an early game character, and mollywop it. But when you do take your time, the fight itself forced me to play differently. Having the Shade zoom and dash around was unexpected. And, if the boss was hard, it may even be somewhat stressful since missing an attack may lead to you being punished quite severely. Did you know that the Shade has this green projectile that it throws? Because I didn't. I had no idea it had this projectile that roots you for a moment while the Shade does its grab attack. I was really surprised. It was almost like I was playing new Elden Ring content because this enemy felt entirely unique. This enemy is why I have never had too many issues with catacombs in Elden Ring. The catacomb burnout will happen at different times for different players, but you won't find them all if you are not using a guide. I wouldn't be surprised if the average player only finds around 30 on their first playthrough if you choose to not use a guide. And that's why Elden Ring has some replayability. You will no doubt find some content you have missed on your first playthrough, but you can also appreciate the finer details that this game offers. And there sure is a lot of those finer details in my opinion. I usually don't give ratings to bosses, but I'm going to give the Cemetery Shade a C grade. I think that the asset that was designed here was complex enough to warrant being reused later in the game. And I also think it looks pretty cool. The talking point of reuse and updated models has been brought up a lot more than I intended in just the beginning sections of this video. But hey, that's how Elden Ring is. Not only does Elden Ring reuse its assets from the game itself, as in you will see a lot of fucking reuse from the assets that are unique to Elden Ring, but it also reused a lot from the past Souls games as well. I will not be listing them off here, but if you've played Dark Souls 3 or even any of the past Souls games, you've definitely noticed it. This is of course another double-edged sword, and I think that the negativity surrounding reuse and updates in Elden Ring has rubbed off as the game has gotten older, as the game is turning 3 years old soon. But yeah, the answer is yes, Elden Ring has a metric fuck ton of reuse. In fact, I don't think I have ever played a game with more reuse than Elden Ring, and it does go overboard at times, don't get me wrong. But as we learned in Sekiro, not all reuse is the same. But also, this is a formula that From Software has continued to refine and iterate upon, which is one of the main reasons we got to Elden Ring. Each Miyazaki-led Souls game feels better to play and pilot than the previous game. The Souls games are like stepping stones, and they always one-up each other. I don't know how else I can really say this without shitting on Ubisoft. The Assassin's Creed games are not a consistent bump in quality with each new release. Quality is, well, obviously subjective, but I think the majority of the Souls fandom will agree that each game somewhat one-ups the previous release. And this is yet another reason as to why I can stomach Elden Ring's reuse. I cannot stomach all of it, and we will get to that. But I always remember that From Software games usually get better as they go on, and part of the reuse is why they are getting better. They can take the foundation that was the previous game and make it better. As for the Erdtree Avatar, I don't really have any issues with it. I will, embarrassingly, admit that someone had to point out to me that this was an updated Asylum Demon, but maybe that speaks to the quality that From Software delivers, and it's definitely not the fact that I'm an idiot. The Tree Sentinel enemy is one of the most prominent and most important enemies within Elden Ring. I'm not talking about every Tree Sentinel enemy in this game. No, that's not the case here. Rather, I am speaking about the Tree Sentinel that is outside of the first step, which is probably the first enemy you see that's not the boss that kills you at the start of the game. Now, if you are this far into the video, I'm just going to assume you're pretty good at the game. We both know that the Tree Sentinel was placed as an overpowered enemy that is kind of telling you to go elsewhere. You can, yes, come back to him later. That's part of what makes Elden Ring fun for some people. It's rare for the game to more or less progression lock you because of a lack of skill. That's all great. I enjoy that part of the game. But I like the Tree Sentinel for other reasons. For one, he's my first real memory with Elden Ring. I remember that I woke up around 5 in the morning to play the network test for Elden Ring, since I got an invitation from Bandai and From Software. I, like the rest of you, tried to fight him head on. The network test actually gave you characters that had some interesting weapons and builds to play with, so I thought I could take him. I remember trying to utilize tactics. I was crouching in the bushes to get a sneak attack, and I was giving it my all. I was trying to take this guy down. Of course, I didn't, and I moved on. But the memory is burned into my brain, and it's part of why exploring Limgrave for the first time is one of my favorite memories with Souls. Now, there are a lot of things with this guy that I want to speak on. Part of what makes Sekiro, for example, such an enticing experience is that it's designed so meticulously, and you can design a lot of bosses with small add-ons that are very attractive. Sekiro can be designed with more complex enemies, since FromSoft knows exactly what tools every single player will be using. These small and important details can be designed within Elden Ring as well. The Tree Sentinel enemy can actually counter certain magic attacks and throw them back at you with his shield, which effectively completely counters a part of a player's build. This will definitely make magic players fuck off and come back later, but it also acts as something of a counter. I love when a boss's nuances become more extravagant the finer you zoom in on them. Other bosses in this series may become lesser versions of themselves when you study what they can do. The Tree Sentinel does not fall into this trap, and players that don't brute force him at the start of the game will come back with a new perspective on the game as a whole. Elden Ring is filled to the brim with power progression. This is without a doubt one of the most unbalanced games I have ever played. From Software intentionally placed overpowered summons, overpowered weapons, and so on in this game, with the intention and knowledge that it would turn the game into child's play for how easy it is. And when you come back to the Tree Sentinel with a new weapon, a summon, maybe even a ranged ability, you will feel the power progression, and this boss that was initially giving you trouble now became lesser than you, and you didn't even have to break a sweat. Another realization players may have is that, well, this dude is a mounted enemy. So, let's try some horse action. Let's get a little weird. But just because he is a mounted enemy, does this mean that From Software did a good job at nudging you to use Torrent or introducing horse combat to players? No, not really. I think that the horse combat was somewhat underutilized in Elden Ring as a whole. But I wanted to see how I would fare versus the Tree Sentinel, and I took him while mounted on Torrent. I found it to be a lot easier, for me at least. Torrent is fast enough to punish him when his attack windows are down, and I found that to be something that I could work with really well. If From Software were to do another open world similar to Elden Ring, I think it's clear that the ground-based combat is perfected. Shout out to Dark Souls 3 for pretty much getting us there, and for the most part Elden Ring understood that and they just gave us what feels like unlimited ways to play the game. But horse combat, in my opinion, can use some work. I would like to see Torrent become more than just a movement speed mod, and I think From Software understood this, as they gave Torrent a little fun moment in Shadow of the Erdtree. And while yes, I would love to tell you about it now, I will not lie to you because it'll be a moment until we get there. I finally want to talk about one last thing here. The Tree Sentinel is another good example on why I don't have many issues with reuse in Elden Ring. Mountaintops will change that, don't get me wrong, but this is a high quality asset that is spammed throughout the game. There are a lot of Tree Sentinel enemies in the game, and it may get annoying for some. But I think we can understand that for a high quality asset such as this to be designed in an 80-hour plus game, it will have to be reused multiple times to justify its existence. Plus, I guess it makes sense that you would find this enemy type commonly throughout the lands between. We'll touch upon that idea just a little bit more with Agheel. My thoughts on the Grave Warden Duelist are probably quite predictable by this point in the video. I think his moveset is pretty good, but he does something that most Catacomb bosses simply do not do, and it's that this boss has some character. When you emerge from the mist, he has this well-animated cloak throw that I didn't notice until I was looking back at my footage. Part of the style that adds onto the Duelist is his unique appearance in Elden Ring. He looks like something you would find in a gladiator fighting pit rather than the lands between. Like most of the Catacombs in Elden Ring, he has a cool moveset, but he's sadly too easy. Seeing the design and care that was put into his fight and animations becomes a chore, since I have to always hold myself back from decimating him. I would go as far to say that buffing a third of his HP would be appropriate. Still, I think he's pretty good. What makes the Runebear a successful boss is that he's thematically placed appropriately and isn't haphazardly shoved into a catacomb just because there needed to be a boss for the catacomb to exist. You will find the bear in an actual cave, not a catacomb, and that is a very deliberate video game choice and asset. It makes the act of exploring his cave a little bit more meaningful because of this. As for the bear itself, I think it shows Elden Ring's balance as a whole. Elden Ring's open world and catacombs are on the easier side. There was never a distinctive point in the open world where I really felt that From Software challenge. Whether From Soft was going for that or not, I don't really know. So this is where I have to rate the bear as another enemy that could have used a health buff. With the bear's massive size, I was hoping he would be more menacing and dangerous. You can find more of these bears in the overworld, and they are more of a challenge for the player, and with this being a strict 1v1, I was hoping for more of a challenge from this beast. I can at least say that he is a finished asset, and he feels like a fun enemy to fight. Because as I have played through these games, I struggle to remember a true bear boss fight, making this one of the more unique models From Software has ever designed. Throughout the many Miyazaki-led From Software games, Patches has been a recurring character that has always driven us a bit mad. Whether he is kicking us to our deaths or trapping us, he is usually present. And since he always manages to gull us into one of his devious schemes, that means he's pretty smart. And Patches, believe it or not, can predict the future. He was trying to communicate all along, because his weapon of choice are the ultimate weapons to defeat Radahn in Shadow of the Erdtree. He has a shield and a thrusting spear. This was secretly one of the best builds to defeat Radahn, and Patches, the Deceiver, was attempting to communicate with us. We just didn't know it. That's why he concedes halfway through his fight. We were the bad guys all along. But in all seriousness, I think it's pretty fun to see Patches have his own fight like this. It's nothing spectacular, but it's very in character for Patches. His weapons allow him to be as annoying as possible, and he will eventually give up and become a famous merchant. I think that Agheel is a fascinating boss. Not only that, but I think he's one of the more interesting bosses to talk about that's not a main remembrance boss. It's safe to say that I think he's pretty awesome. There is a lot that he does right, and I don't really know where to start. So we're going to start with Agheel by talking about Elden Ring's open world. I think that Elden Ring should have had more memorable open world bosses. There simply is not very many bosses in the open world that A, take advantage of Torrent to make him feel like he's more than just a movement speed mod, and B, From Software didn't incorporate many great bosses into the open world. You may think that I'm crazy, because there's a lot of open world bosses, and I'm about to speak highly of Agheel. Agheel is one of the few great open world bosses. Now, it's no secret that From Software may have the best boss design in the entire industry. Their bosses are great, they're hard, and you know the whole spiel by this point, don't you? What was severely lacking in Elden Ring's open world are these great open world bosses. I would say that for an open world game, Elden Ring desperately needed a remembrance boss in the open world. The game really could have used a true open world remembrance boss, just as I mentioned, or even a boss that starts in the open world and you fight the boss while on Torrent and chase the boss to the boss arena. This would make Torrent feel more incorporated into the game while also making the open world feel more alive, since it would have thrown all of us off guard. It is saddening to me that we didn't see this even in Shadow of the Erdtree, and I don't even think what I'm asking for is a huge ask. Agheel's fight space feels like his very own boss boss arena. There's not a whole lot to do in this murky water. From Software seemingly designed this large space solely for Agheel, and I respect that. It makes his arena feel like Gale's arena in Dark Souls 3, or maybe even the Orphan of Kos' arena. It's not a simple and obvious video game asset that is simply a large rectangle like we would see with Vort or Midra. No, Agheel is a big motherfucking dragon, and this large dragon deserves the spectacle and demands the space. This is why he has spectacle, without a cutscene and without dialogue. He demands respect, and you see his confidence when you are not engaged with his AI. He will stare you down. He's not afraid of an early game maidenless tarnished. Okay, so he's clearly great. Let's talk about his moveset that is spammed in Elden Ring. There's no denying that every single Elden Ring player saw a few other dragons in the open world and said, "Nuh-uh, not today," and they just ran straight past it. Most of the base game dragons share Agheel's moveset with very little variety, and in the popular video essay made by Joseph Anderson, he remarked on his experience with Agheel. He said that Agheel was one of his favorite initial moments in the entirety of Elden Ring. He felt like a badass rushing towards Agheel on his trusty steed, but Agheel's memory slowly became diluted because From Software placed so many dragons in the base game. Now, that is his experience. No one can take that away from him. I can definitely see where he's coming from, and hey, I may even agree with some of his points. But I, for one, don't really care that From Software placed so many dragons in the overworld because it makes the open world feel more alive. Dragons are everywhere, and Caelid is filled with them. And if you can immerse yourself within the open world, then these dragons make the world feel more alive. So, is Agheel the best of these dragons? Yeah, absolutely. I don't think many will deny that opinion. The first time you see Agheel, and this dragon moveset is the best. Most will also agree that the mechanics were just the most memorable with Agheel. He can be fought on foot or on torrent. I still think that From Software didn't do a great job at teaching the player to utilize torrent in open world fights, especially because he feels so underpowered at times, and you can easily become staggered off of him. I remember using torrent a lot more in the early game of Elden Ring, but when I became more powerful and had access to powerful combat abilities, torrent became that movement speed mod I keep bringing up. But regardless of how you choose to fight him, I think that veteran Souls players will remark at Agheel's design, because we used to live in a world where From Software's dragon fights were a bit of a mixed bag. We've seen the lows of Dragon, God, and Demon Souls, but Elden Ring kind of made dragon fights some of the best bosses in the entire game. My hot take is that Agheel should have been the initial design of what we can expect from the overworld bosses in Elden Ring. I am the type of lad that loves open world Souls, and if From Software goes back to open world Souls, I think they desperately need to up their open world bosses, and Agheel would be a great starting foundation for that type of thing. With Margit being our first real boss on this list, he will open a huge can of worms on the discussion that can be had with Elden Ring as a whole. In my mind, Elden Ring almost has no contest, as it is one of the most interesting games to talk about within the Souls community. The initial reception to the game was overwhelmingly positive. Then a few video essays came out expressing their distaste and issues with the game, and then we had a weird cycle of people having a lot of mixed opinions about the game. Like any piece of art, Elden Ring has flaws. A lot of the flaws that some people see in Elden Ring, Margit exemplifies. Almost no one will levy distaste for Margit's cutscene, aesthetic, and his role in the game. But his gameplay is where you will run into some bumps. He has everything that someone either loves or hates in an Elden Ring boss. You will find people that think he's too hard, they don't like the delayed attacks, they think the delayed attacks look awkward, it feels like he pulls out random moves that you cannot predict, which makes certain moves feel like a coin flip on whether you will be punished or not, and the frequency at which he attacks. All of these, or maybe just a few things that I just rattled off, could be issues you experienced, but something that almost everyone experiences is his difficulty. First, let me plant a question in your brain and you can ponder on this question as the Margit discussion continues. Margit has more moves that he can utilize than a lot of the past Gatekeeper bosses that From Software has designed. Having these moves does not make for an objectively better boss, because you have to analyze what the boss is doing and form an opinion on how you personally value the quality of these moves. So, my question to you is, would you rather have a Gatekeeper boss such as Margit, who is more complex than the past Gatekeeper bosses, or would you rather have something like the Asylum Demon or Udex Gundyr? I know what my answer is, and I think that it'll be obvious as to why I chose Margit as we continue to talk about him. Margit is my choice, even though he elicits some frustration from myself and other players. With the beginning of Elden Ring being so precisely designed to push you towards Margit, a lot of players, new and old, grievously struggled on him when the game was initially released. Part of this is because, well, as I said, Margit is more complex than every other enemy that you have fought up to this point. But I also think that some of the difficulty is not a skill issue on the player's end, and that may elicit that frustration frustration that I spoke of earlier. But I also think that's part of what makes him so difficult is that he has almost every trick in the book. If you can think of it, chances are he has it. Generally speaking, Elden Ring's bosses attack a lot more frequently than the other games, making it so you may develop the habit of panic rolling because of the frequency of attacks. Oh wait, too bad, because he has plenty of roll catches in his kit. Some may even feel overwhelmed by the delayed attacks that he will do. Well, I hope you get used to them because there is more to come. I can list off all of the moves that he will do, but that would be unnecessary because this is what a gatekeeper boss is supposed to do. They teach you the necessary skills you will need in Elden Ring, and I think that everything that I have spoken about, Margit does pretty well. I can stomach delayed attacks more than the average person. I think it adds needed variety in the kits. I also don't think any of these delayed animations look awkward with Margit. But I mentioned that Margit has made me a bit frustrated, so why is that exactly? Well, it's the fact that he's hard. This is not me attempting to flex, but I was very experienced with the Souls games by the time I got to Margit in Elden Ring, so I never really had any issues with Margit prior to the most recent playthrough that I did for this video. And it's that I simply cannot tell when he is done attacking at times, and I wasn't able to figure out when I could attack without being hit. Now, I know this is the lowest hanging fruit with this boss. We've all heard at least one person say that he has a few undodgeable moves, and I'm not going to say that. What I will say is that someone who is experienced with this genre can look back at their footage and not really be able to tell when Margit is done attacking and when I can actually punish him. Either that shows I'm a massive idiot, which, hey, I'm willing to accept that, or it's the fact that From Software didn't do a great job on making it clear when he will do certain combo extensions. The best way I can demonstrate this is to show you with his 3 combo attack string that starts with his magic sword. I was not able to dodge this move while rolling towards him. Every single time I would get clipped on the last hit, so I decided to roll away from him, and I would get my hit in after those 3 attacks. But sometimes he decided to do more than 3 attacks while I was going in for my attack, and I would get hit. This is the move that was getting me frustrated. Not because I was getting hit, but because I simply couldn't understand how I was supposed to tell when and why he was doing that combo extension. I'm sure someone in the comment section has already typed the answer, and to that I say thank you. But if I put myself in the shoes of a new player, this is a very frustrating experience. These new players are dealing with an already challenging boss on top of attacks that seem at times almost impossible to tell when you can actually get your punish in. And that very well could lead to a poor experience. Some may counter that argument with overleveling or spirit ashes, and I don't think that those should always be the go-to card to pull when someone is dealing with an overwhelming amount of difficulty. But we'll talk about that later. I do want to make a counter argument to my own frustration real quick. I think the unpredictability adds tension. Even though I was starting to get annoyed, I never felt this way when I was playing the game normally because Margit is that fucking cool. He's complex and fast, and he attacks very rapidly, making for a boss that I enjoy a lot. And while I do think every move in the game should be reliably dodgeable without something like frame-perfect dodges, these little bits of chip damage that I am describing make for a ruthless bloodbath you have to overcome. And that is why I will choose Margit as the best gatekeeper boss if we remove Sekiro from the batch. Because that's exactly what a lot of Elden Ring bosses are. They may feel a bit unfair, they attack a lot, and they are certainly a lot harder than the Dark Souls 3 bosses. And that's fun to me. A boss having a small edge like what Margit may have is what makes my heart beat. It's why I hop on these games. I like to struggle and I like to die. And with From Software pushing the Souls combat further than what they probably expected it could do, things like this may be necessary. But I can also understand someone getting frustrated if they are taking attacks that they feel are bullshit and require very specific strategies such as Bloodhound Step to overcome. At the end of the day, it's entirely subjective. But I also think that if someone does have these issues, the hard and fast answer should not be skill issue, get good, or a variety of other commonly used counterpoints. Because I feel like those responses are usually ignoring what the other person is saying to blindly defend Elden Ring. I think that the end of Stormveil and Godrick are examples of what I mentioned when we talked about Agheel, and it's that while the Souls games do feel familiar, From Software always iterates upon their past work and rarely steps backwards. Stormveil is probably my favorite legacy dungeon in the base game of Elden Ring, and it contains 2 of the stronger bosses in the game itself. Godrick and most of the Runebearer bosses are better than most base game Dark Souls 3 bosses, and go toe-to-toe with some of the best bosses in Dark Souls 3. And speaking of Elden Ring's quality, exploring Limgrave and doing the 2 bosses that are within Stormveil Castle very well could be a picture book of my favorite memories within Souls. Yes, more than Dark Souls 1's first half, more than Agheel, and more than the gothic horror that is Yharnam. Simply put, I loved every second I spent in the initial few hours of Elden Ring, and as much as I may not want to admit it, I think the peak of the game resides within the first few hours of the game. You are not worn down by the length of the game, you most likely won't have any poor experiences with unoptimized balance. It's simply From Software at their best. And while I do enjoy Margit just a little bit more, Godrick does not leave me let down. I'm not one to analyze and dissect cutscenes in the Soulsborne games, as I think they usually do a fine enough job at setting the stage and making the fight not feel a bit awkward, because if cutscenes did not exist, we would simply walk into the boss arena and look at them sitting idly for a few moments. I mention this because I think that Godrick has the best cutscene in Elden Ring. He has a lot of what I enjoy from Software games in his first phase and second cutscene. From Software is the king at showing me weird shit that I couldn't really imagine myself. Seeing a man with multiple limbs scattered on his body while simultaneously not just looking muddy and grotesque is what I love with Miyazaki-led Souls games. Most of the Miyazaki-led Souls games models aren't just flat out gross like the Rotten in Dark Souls 2. I think that the Rotten is one of the most uninteresting and uninspired models that From Software has ever made. I can describe him in one word, and that's gross. And I believe that these finer details are why Miyazaki Souls games will not be dethroned for a considerable amount of time, if ever. I mentioned that the initial few hours of Elden Ring are my favorite moments throughout the entirety of the game, so let's get into why. As I mentioned already, I do enjoy Margit a little bit more than Godrick. Margit feels like he's more of an active duelist that would always keep me on my toes. I feel like he forced me to grasp concepts a lot better than what Godrick does. Godrick is the delayed attack boss. Almost all of his attacks are delayed, and while that may sound like a bad thing, having a boss be good at something, even if it is something as simple as delayed attacks, is a good thing. If a boss simply felt fair and nothing more, there wouldn't be that much power fantasy that makes the boss become memorable. You can definitely make a boss fair, but if they are lacking power or a move that makes them strong, you will forget them over time. That's why so many of the catacomb bosses are forgettable. It's very easy to walk into a catacomb, push a few buttons, and the fight is over before it really gets started. From Software simply did not give them a salient thing for us to remember. And with Godrick being the king of delayed attacks, I think proper praise should be given here because I don't think that these delayed attacks look awkward. How tolerable they are from person to person is, again, subjective, but they are not animated in a way that I feel look awkward. I'll save some of the awkward delays for later, but I can show you an awkward delayed attack that is in the second to last boss in Liza P. So, if you do not want to see that, then you can feel free to skip ahead a few moments because I do not want to spoil it for you. In Simon Manus' boss fight in Liza P, he is bloated with ergo, and because of that, he has a very large body similar to Godrick. Where his delayed attacks can become a bit awkward is that there are a few attacks that are delayed, but also can't be seen on the camera when you are in melee range. That may be a bit annoying or offensive to some, but the awkward delay he has when he jumps in the air and kind of floats for a moment just looks kind of bad to me. I don't know why, and it somewhat takes me out of the fight. Godrick does not present any of these awkward delays that Simon Manus has, or at least he doesn't to me. And with me saying that I think his delayed attacks are fine, I do think that if he didn't have his pretty boss arena well animated moves and his presentation especially, I don't think I would have considered him a strong Runebearer boss. Very similar to how I feel with Lady Maria. I think everything else is better than her and his fight, but they still have really good fights. It's just not something that I adore like I do with some of our later bosses. But what Godrick has that Lady Maria doesn't is that he is well balanced. I know not everyone agrees with me, but Lady Maria probably could have had an overall health buff, and giving her some hyper armor would have made it for an overall better fight. It's so easy to diminish her first phase, and she doesn't deserve that because she truly is really great. Godrick doesn't have this issue, thankfully. He also takes less damage as you are attacking him during his phase transition, while Lady Maria takes full damage. I think From Software handled the balance of the Stormveil Castle bosses better than most Elden Ring enemies and bosses. And with all of that now out of the way, the balance of Elden Ring will now become a bit messy for most players when they step outside of Stormveil. By this point in the game, you are going to accidentally overlevel yourself, and some of the bosses will suffer because of that. The duelist enemies that you will find in Catacombs continue to write the sad truth that Catacombs are simply too easy. If I am being honest, I had no idea the duelist enemy types had multiple variations. Our last duelist enemy wielded two hammer-like weapons, and this variation has one large axe. I don't recall seeing these enemies in the overworld, so I do want to reiterate this point. To me at least, it's pretty sad that these enemies will not be appreciated by the masses. They are too easy to defeat and or overlevel. Dodging the moves that you are seeing on screen here elevates the classic Souls combat feel of dodge and utilize the attack window that you are given. But it's also a well-designed enemy similar to our last duelist enemy. The character model may be reused, but the moveset is entirely new, and there's a lot of care in this moveset. Do you know how some of the main bosses in Elden Ring have a few moves that are exceedingly rare to see? Seeing some of these moves is a novelty, and the Frenzied Duelist has one of these moves where he grabs the chain at the end of his handle and spins the chain in a circular motion as a ranged ability. This move isn't something that I notice on my many playthroughs, and it's something that most players probably didn't notice at all because Catacombs are too easy. Why were they made this easy? I really don't know, but I wish they weren't. Evergel bosses are an odd inclusion that From Software decided to do, as I don't think they add enough to justify their existence. Most enemies that you will encounter are simple reuses and nothing more. While Catacombs as a whole may not be super exciting and memorable, I can still give Catacombs some credit because there is some new things in Catacombs, even if it is just the basic level design that you need to navigate through to find the boss. And this is where I have to rate this Evergel boss. He has this issue where he doesn't have the power fantasy that I spoke about with Godrick. He's pretty good at moving around quickly, but I don't think that's really enough. I never saw him do anything outside of his basic melee attacks, and only having a few melee attacks isn't enough to impress me, as these melee attacks aren't that impressive in their own right. Still, he's better than most Dark Souls 1 and 2 enemy mobs, so I guess that's worth something. But just to be clear, this is the weakest enemy we have encountered so far, and maybe that speaks to From Software's overall high quality. Our last Evergel boss may have been a bit of a letdown, so From Software decided to throw us a bone with Zamor. Even though Zamor will be seen when we eventually get to the mountaintops, the moveset that has been designed here still works extraordinarily well. There's a lot that went into this one basic enemy, and even though you will most definitely have your fill with this enemy by the end of the game, I still like to appreciate the hard work that went into this boss. For starters, I think that the model looks more interesting than most other Catacomb and Evergel enemies. I'm a big fan of the long, droopy hair that From Software gave this guy. On the flip side, something that I don't like is how passive this enemy is in Phase 1. It's very common to see him retreating with a fast backstep, making the first phase feel like a punching bag. I'm not exactly sure if I just got bad RNG with Phase 1, but I can at least say that Phase 2 is where the personality of this enemy comes into play. There's a lot of ice attacks and abilities that you have to look out for. These can range from frost attacks on the ground or even a large AoE ability. I like how this simple level enemy is more than just a few attacks with its weapon. It makes fighting these guys a lot more memorable. I think that most of us had a pretty similar experience with Leonine Misbegotten, where we completely skipped Castle Morn and came here as an overpowered and over-leveled behemoth that slaughtered everything by breathing on whatever we didn't like, with no pushback at all. And if you didn't, well, this was my first experience with this boss. After I defeated Godrick, I gawked at the view ahead of me and continued forward, not knowing that I was ruining part of the game for myself. This is one of Elden Ring's fatal flaws that comes with an open world. For a game that is supposed to be challenging, you can easily take away the joy of the challenge by no fault of your own. And since I am assuming that most of you took down the Leonine Misbegotten with your eyes closed, I still think, and have always wished, that From Software would have added a minimum level gate to match the player, so this does not happen. Some may say that there is a power fantasy to overleveling enemies, and while I am not here to argue with them, I simply disagree. I want some challenge, I want some pushback, because it's too easy to ruin the experience for myself. Moreover, I still cannot deny that the Misbegotten is very easy to stagger since he has no armor on. He does have a pretty neat moveset, but I can still smash my way through that moveset quite easily. If I judged this enemy in a vacuum, then we would have a little bit more to talk about. When I listen to other people talk about this enemy, they always remark on the speed of Leonine, and while he is fast, I don't think he's too fast for the game. No doubt, Elden Ring may have definitely made enemies that are at the cap of aggressiveness, and this enemy may be a sign of that. Since From Software has pushed this combat system to what feels like its max potential, seeing hyper-aggressive enemies such as Hoarah or even Leonine is fascinating because I wonder if this combat system is truly perfected, and if it is perfected, what iterations will be seen in future games with this system. I don't really know. I have a few ideas, but those are just ideas. You can encounter this enemy again, but I think that the pretty boss arena and extrinsic reward you get for killing this guy make him worth doing. I do wish he was a bit harder, and we're getting to the point where I'm going to start talking about Elden Ring's overall balance. What makes the Black Knife Assassin somewhat interesting isn't what the boss is capable of doing, rather the fact that this enemy spawns in with a quarter of his HP missing. Catacombs, for some, can become a chore the longer they play Elden Ring because they are quite predictable. Navigating the catacombs in the base game and finding the boss at the end isn't a challenge, nor does it offer me intrinsic value. Catacombs are relatively simple, and with the amount that is in the base game of Elden Ring, that was going to be a given. But I can at least say that when I realized that the Black Knife Assassin was missing some of its HP, this catacomb kind of made me turn my brain back on. That is welcome, especially here, because I entered this catacomb completely over-leveled, and it just takes a few hits from my weapon to move on from this catacomb and forget its existence after I leave. I don't want to oversell the simple act of reducing an enemy's HP, but I think that it is so simple and such an easy way to get me to refocus that I can accept the novelty of this catacomb just because of that. Okay, so I am going to rip the bandage off on this one and just come out and say it. I think that the base game of Elden Ring's open world is too easy. I know, how dare I. From Software is known to make things super challenging, and here I am saying that it is too easy. The thing is, I never really put together how intrinsically driven I was with Elden Ring's open world, and that intrinsic value I have is just the sheer beauty of Elden Ring. I do know that most of us agree that Elden Ring as a whole is a very beautiful game. I would even say that this is From Software's prettiest game. Things look good regardless of the angle or distance. Elden Ring is simply beautiful, and I enjoyed that about the game. But what I didn't realize until this playthrough is that the open world is easy as fuck. Clearing camps may refill your Estus, sites of grace are littered throughout the open world, catacombs are easy, and more disappointingly, the open world bosses aren't that challenging either. I have mentioned it before, but as a reminder, I don't think the open world bosses in Elden Ring are spectacular, and I do wish we would have seen at least one Remembered's boss be a part of the open world, alongside having enemies in the open world participate in that fight as well. This brings us to Tibia Mariner, and this could make for a fun ranking video where someone ranks enemies that look cool and interesting, but fall flat with their movesets, because Tibia is not hard. And the enemy is all around very fragile. Not every enemy needs to be as hard as Millennia, but with how easy I feel Elden Ring's open world really is, the open world bosses could have made up for some of this. And if Tibia did do this exact thing, I would be singing its praises. This enemy looks pretty cool, and it is not a typical fantasy enemy that I would expect from Elden Ring. It's not a dragon, it's not a knight, it's a ghost piloting a boat. But that's kind of all it does. It does have a few boat slams, it can summon AI, and it may even splash some water, but it doesn't really do much. And that's a shame because whether you are over-leveled or under-leveled, this enemy is just kind of disappointing. If From Software designed this enemy for more thematic purposes, as we are in a puddle of water, then I'd say it worked on that front, but nothing else. The more I analyze Elden Ring's open world bosses, the more disappointed I become. I do love the game, it is my favorite From Software game, but I wish there was more to the open world bosses. The Crystalian may be an easy enemy to defeat, like most of the catacomb dungeons, but these enemies stand out just a little bit more in my mind because of how they fight. I can't think of many, or any other enemies for that matter, that fight with chakrams. I always appreciate fighting enemies that are not basic fantasy enemies that are within the expected from a dark fantasy setting. The only downside of this enemy is that I wish we were able to see a full-blown boss use these types of weapons, as I won't be forgetting them anytime soon. It's almost like Lady Butterfly in Sekiro. Few enemies use their legs and feet as a weapon, and that's part of why I probably like her more than the average person. I only wish it was harder to stagger the Crystalian so I can interact with the moveset for a bit longer, as what was designed here is quite well done. What I like about Loretta is that she is yet another high quality asset with an Elden Ring, and her reuse is very innocuous. Reuse in Elden Ring is like anything in life. Too much of it can be a bad thing. The mere existence of mountaintops is almost universally agreed upon as one of the worst areas in the entire game. There simply was not enough added in that area to justify its existence. Loretta's reuse later in the game doesn't add really anything at all, but since it's a short stop on the lead up to Millennia, it's not unwelcome either. Loretta does what I wish more Elden Ring bosses would do, and it's the fact that she's really good at fighting in melee range and casting spells to always keep your brain aware of what's going on. Most other bosses do a good job at getting into melee range to keep the pace up, whether that be with some sort of dive or a way that gets you into melee range. Some bosses such as Radahn in Shadow the Erdtree does have the ability to do a few ranged moves, such as his Meteor Throw, but that is just one ability, and he doesn't specialize in ranged combat and melee combat like Loretta. I really like how this is seen in her gameplay too. At times, she will rush towards you, throw out her spells, and try to attack you simultaneously. Attacks like these force you to refine your dodge to an even higher level, and since most players will probably get hit by attacks like these, I think the chip damage adds a way for her jack-of-all-trades playstyle to shine without feeling bullshit. We are pretty far away from hating on Millennia, but after fighting her here, I almost wish From Software would have made an advanced Loretta fight instead of Millennia somewhat similar to Mohg's 2 fights. What makes the Ancestor Spirit a unique and memorable boss is that it was the first time I vividly remember a deer boss in the series. We have seen our fair share of armored knights, sword-wielding duelists, but having bosses such as the Ancestor Spirit or even a spider like Rom from Bloodborne is sometimes all you need to make a boss memorable. Having attacks that are molded around that model is what makes these unique fights stand out just a little bit more in my mind, and that is something that I think Rom from Bloodborne failed at. Rom summons projectile attacks, and while those are interesting in their own right, I think From Software could have leaned into the spider aspect of the boss a little bit more for my liking. I think the Ancestor Spirit succeeds with that here because it has these middle ground attacks where it does these animalistic and wild attacks. The animal flails his antlers around for a source of its damage, and he has enough magic-based abilities with the pretty blue fire that he can utilize. I think the Ancestor Spirit works well as he stands because of the beauty and melodious tune that is the OST here. This boss embodies what Elden Ring failed to do at a consistent rate, and it's giving players more than just mechanically interesting bosses to play against. A lot of Elden Ring bosses are two phases, and they were designed to be mechanically interesting, and, I will not lie, most of them succeeded at that. What I just described there would be every Runebearer boss besides Rennala. And with how large of a game Elden Ring clearly is, the mechanical complexities no doubt fill the game. But I find myself appreciating this boss a lot more as time goes on. As I played through these games back to back with this video series, I find myself appreciating soothing bosses like the Ancestor Spirit or Divine Dragon as some of the better examples. And for that, I think this boss accomplished what I appreciate from time to time, a nice tune I can listen to with some pretty colors to view while I fight the enemy. There are bosses, such as Mohg, that were designed to be slow but hard-hitting, enemies that will punish you for making one small mistake. If Mohg was that simple, he would be boring, quite frankly. He's more than just a slow, hard-hitting boss. He has his blood attacks that force you to properly position yourself in his arena, and then you have the Red Wolf of Radagon that is antithetical to Mohg's design. The Red Wolf of Radagon is extremely aggressive and does a good job at trying to burst you down with his magic and speed. I think that this is something that From Software did a good job with in Elden Ring, and it doesn't get pointed out that much. The overall aggression of enemies varies quite a lot in Elden Ring, making it so you cannot rely on an internal metronome to carry you through most of the game. The base game Dark Souls 1 bosses all felt very sluggish and slow, and the fights resembled that. Dark Souls 1's bosses are mostly similar to Mohg, slow and hard-hitting. Some of the bosses in that game are still quite good, but I think From Software had a goal of making Elden Ring enemies feel dynamic in this regard. Some may even say that the bosses are almost too fast and too aggressive. I don't think they're wrong when they say that because they are speaking subjectively. They are saying that the bosses are too fast for their own liking, and I don't think that's unfair. Because the Red Wolf is such a constant threat, he doesn't slow down, and his boss fight has little downtime. Your healing time frames are minimal, and this was not an oversight from Software. In turn, his health is laughably small. Someone has probably bursted this boss down without even meaning to because his health pool is almost nothing, making this boss extremely fragile. I like this type of design. I don't love it, but I can live with it. I myself prefer slower bosses in Elden Ring such as Bale or Godrick, but this is a welcome addition. Morgott is kind of like this, and we'll talk about him in time, but I like the pressure that the Red Wolf offers. But at the same time, he doesn't do anything that I have not seen before. The thing that makes me the most upset with Rennala is that I think she proves what I said when we were talking about the Ancestor Spirit. People generally don't care about cool gimmick bosses as much nowadays. They are not something that I hear people asking for them to be completely vanished and forgotten about, but I do not hear many that share the excitement with a gimmick boss such as this. I am not really sure if it's because it goes against the highs of what a Souls game is for a lot of people, which is of course a hard boss with a super complex moveset. Admittedly, I am also pretty hypocritical just for saying any of this. It's not common for me to talk about my favorite moments in the Souls games and talk about Rennala, the Divine Dragon, or even the Storm King and Demon Souls. The other bits of a Souls game outweigh what these bosses are by a mile, and I am just glad From Software has not forgotten the importance of these bosses. But with how large Elden Ring is, including the DLC, I would have been open to having one or two more of these gimmick-style bosses. I think From Software even understands this as they try to develop Mateer with whimsical moves and art, while trying to keep the mechanics complex. I don't really know how that worked out now that Shadow of the Erdtree's been out for a while, but I guess I am jumping ahead of myself. When I hear the masses talk about their experiences with Rennala, through other video essays, or through online forums, there is always one thing they have in common. It's that they did not initially catch on to the fact that the singing student is the one to focus on. I do not want to sound mean here, but I think From Software made it obvious enough, and figuring that out makes the fight feel a bit one-dimensional. Hunting down the singing student isn't hard, and dodging the projectiles that are being thrown at you isn't really something that I have to consciously do while I'm sprinting towards the student. And yes, I do understand that this type of boss isn't supposed to be hard, but it's also a bit upsetting to me that I can essentially turn my brain off and not have to worry about anything in phase 1. This is not the first time From Software has done something oddly similar to this, because the Divine Dragon in Sekiro does the exact same thing as well. Fighting the old dragons of the tree is also brain off if you ask me, and it's sadly something I hate to say because From Software always develops games that force me to always engage and be aware of what is actually happening in their games. And of course, this philosophy is with everything From Software does, whether that be the storytelling or the bosses, it's all there. But what I really want to say is that I guess all this kind of makes me look like a bit of a jerk, and I want to have my cake and eat it too. I ask for a few more gimmick bosses in Elden Ring, and the main one we get in the game itself has never really been that interesting to me. I'm the kind of person that can really get into atmosphere, and with how strong it is in this entire fight, I think it saves it from being almost entirely forgettable. But the intrinsic value I get from this atmosphere does not match the highs of some of From Software's other gimmick bosses. I think it does get better with Phase 2 for most players though. The people that are looking for a real challenge and don't like the gimmick side of the boss can have their interest reignited, and the people that enjoy the beauty of this fight can still enjoy themselves. The pretty boss arena is what we'll talk about first. I don't think many will deny that this is the prettiest boss arena From Software has ever designed. Not only is it something that most can latch onto with the moonlit water and the pretty colors, but Rennala also demands the space almost similar to Rom, although I would say Rom demands it a lot more. Rennala is very good at playing the keep-away game and fighting you at range, and at times I am sure players have grown frustrated because they are annoyed at being pelted to death, but I think it's a welcome challenge. I find the peak of this fight to be when she's casting her spells while she summons her spirits, forcing me to be aware of my surroundings and not just what the one AI is doing. For what Elden Ring does with its bosses and mechanics, Rennala is a relatively simple boss, and even though I have some gripes with the execution in Phase 1, I still think she is a welcome addition to the game. The Magma Wyrm enemies are another enemy that From Software used a lot throughout the open world. I still have the same thought process with these enemies, as it makes sense, to me at least, that these enemies would be populated throughout the lands between. I don't have an issue seeing this guy, or the dragons, or the other enemies used multiple times, but it's a unique case where I can understand someone saying that there are too many reused enemies in Elden Ring. We've talked a lot about that for now, so let's move on. What I do want to say is that I like Makar. I think he's pretty good. He oddly enough does what Quelaag failed to do, and it's that his arena space isn't too big nor too small. I think him spitting lava on the ground is a fun way to add character to an enemy while upping the ante at the same time. I generally like hazardous terrain in a boss encounter similar to Mohg's Blood Throw, and I think it was really well done here. I do want to say that there could be times where his lava forces you to reposition and the worm's large model would sometimes clip through the camera. Elden Ring has its fair share of really terrible camera moments, and while I think they should be a thing in the past, such as bad hitboxes, as I can't recall having more than one bad hitbox in Elden Ring, I can tolerate some minor camera issues every now and then. Although I don't want that minor gripe to take away from Makar. He's well done, his arena is large enough to not be annoying, and he's an overall good boss to fight against. If there's one thing that my many years of gaming has taught me, it's that ranged enemies are squishy, in turn making them easier to kill. And melee enemies are usually a bit tankier since they have to earn their way into melee range to do damage. This is where the Perfumer and Misbegotten warrior encounter come into play, as utilizing simple game sense can go a really long way. Perfumer enemies are generally pretty squishy and easy to kill, and killing her early can make it so she cannot support the carry of this fight with her shield she will deploy throughout her encounter. Since the Elden Ring and Souls combat system can function a lot better at handling two enemies at once when compared to Sekiro, I tend to like fights such as these two, even if they are nothing special. I have played Elden Ring for hundreds of hours by this point in its life cycle, and just to quickly remind you, this game does turn 3 years old this year. It's common to find a new hidden detail in open world games, mainly because of the sheer size of the game, and this is where Garris comes into the picture, as I don't recall ever fighting this enemy in the hundreds of hours that I have played Elden Ring. Is he just an NPC with a weapon that a player can use? Yep. At least that's what he looks like, but I think the animations of the spells and his weapon casts are good enough to warrant using him, even if he is a bit of a pushover. He, and this cave, may feel a bit unique to people because this cave actually has 2 bosses within it, making it one of the most unique caves in Elden Ring, since that is something of a rare occurrence. Even though my build does really well into this encounter with the Black Knife Assassin, I still find myself getting frustrated with the invisibility that is present here. I do want to offer my condolences to players that played Elden Ring as a ranged build, since doing this encounter as a non-melee build must have been as frustrating as trying to hit a bullseye while blindfolded. The trick here, well, isn't much of a trick, as the water tells you where the enemy is and where you should place your attention. While all of this does make sense to me, with my build being a really good choice here, it still leaves me with memories of boredom more than anything else. The two Tree Sentinels that you can come across may demonstrate how far you've come with stats and as a player. At this point in the game, someone can encounter these two with proper stats and skill and subsequently make these two look like pushovers. Their overall design and placement here also doesn't feel out of place, nor does fighting two of them become a chore to do. With the Side of Grace being so close to where these two are located, you can actually sneak behind and aggro one of the two enemies. I have fought these two multiple times now, and I have always enjoyed fighting them solo and forcing a 1v2 for the extra challenge. I think they are balanced well enough and judiciously reused to not feel like a chore to do. An underlying appreciation that I have for From Software games is their artistic talent and how they can make things look as interesting as they do. And I don't want to come off as rude and say this in a rude way, but if there's one thing that From Software hasn't always outdone themselves on, it's their artistic talent. I can still hop on Dark Souls 1 right this moment and view everything in that game and still think that the art that went into that game, the models, etc., they're all still really top tier. You can have the best graphics on the market, but when you have an ugly character model, it's all for nothing. I say this because I think Gillica is a pretty epic looking model that I completely forgot about since I have not fought her in a while. It's not just her purple eyes, there's more to her than that. Her thin and lanky body make for an eerie and grotesque looking model that I enjoy simply looking at. Her moveset though isn't anything that I found to be special. She does have ferocious, animalistic attacks and sounds, but with these lesser bosses in terms of how important they are, I usually just need one or two interesting things to latch onto to make it worthwhile. And her model did just that. And with all of that being said, I think she's one of the more memorable non-rune bearer bosses in the game. What makes this version of the Godskin Apostle interesting is that, well, he is quite literally out of place. There is no doubt in my mind that From Software intended for players to fight this AI in particular on foot, not horseback. This is where I can run a little experiment on how well this enemy reacts to a player engaging in horseback combat, and, well, it doesn't. Godskin Apostle doesn't really have the chance to do anything to make the fight viable on his end. He does have a fireball he can throw out, but you don't even have to try and dodge the fireball while on horseback, it kind of just does it for you. I don't have an issue with him being here. In fact, I think it's kind of fun feeling grossly overpowered because of Torrent. If you weave in and out of the fight with charged heavy attacks, you will win, even if it may end up being a slow kill. I mention this for two reasons, the second being more interesting than the first. For one, this still goes back to me wishing that we had better open world bosses. Most of the open world bosses aren't anything above good, and that's fine, I guess. But with Elden Ring being an open world, and From Software being known for many things, one of them being their boss design, I have always been let down by the lack of great and unique open world bosses, and of course, duo bosses in Elden Ring. But that's besides the point. Let's talk about Elden Ring Night Rain real quick. Huh? You may ask? What does Elden Ring Night Rain have to do with any of this? And it's the fact that Elden Ring Night Rain will have a lot of reuse. Just in the marketing trailer, we saw plenty of reused enemies, animations, and so on. If you are familiar with From Software games, then you can probably guess what to expect. The thing is, as far as I know at least, Night Rain will be Elden Ring characters with special abilities on crack. And this was exactly me when I was fighting the Apostle. He stood no chance versus me because he was really designed to deal with the player while mounted, so he was pretty stale to fight. And that's why I think From Software is holding their cards close and not revealing everything with Night Rain. I highly doubt that the Nameless King we saw in the trailer will literally be ripped from Dark Souls 3 with nothing changed at all. I wouldn't be surprised if it's just King of the Storm, not the Nameless King, and his moveset is expanded from that. Alongside that, they will tune him up to fit Night Rain, buff his damage, increase his speed, etc. But I truly do think that it's not going to be a straight up asset flip. If it is a straight up asset flip, however, then maybe I would have an issue with that. But I don't think it will be a straight up asset flip from Dark Souls 3, and I kind of just have to see it. Because if it is a straight up asset flip, then I think we will run into what I just experienced with the Apostle, just with more health. And if there's one thing I know about From Software, they produce quality, even if it is something that I have seen before. Like most of Elden Ring's catacombs, they offer a nice break from the open world where you can take your foot off the gas pedal. I think that the rewards within a catacomb are usually good enough, and that's also the case with the duo Crystalian enemies. While yes, their movesets don't really synergize together that well, these enemies are relatively weak, so putting them together doesn't feel offensive, such as Godskin Duo or the Duo Guardian Ape. These are probably the most middling enemies within the entirety of Elden Ring, so let's move on. Nestled deep under the lands between is the Sanguine Noble, one of my favorite looking enemies in Elden Ring. There's something so badass with the way the enemy engages himself into this fight. It adds more character and memorability than most of the other enemies that are in the entirety of the game. It's just a shame that he is a novice when it comes to how he fights. He doesn't take advantage of the blood attacks like how Mohg would. Rather, he has just a few moves of swiping and throwing knives at you. His playstyle is, quite frankly, quite boring, but I appreciate Mohg even more because of this guy. I also wish he had more HP, and maybe even more poise, so I can see a little bit more of him. Worm-face enemies are known to possess Deathblight, a rather annoying way to die, but I do think it's used properly here. The Worm-face is a lot more passive and nonchalant, almost like he doesn't really want to fight you. You're just in his way or you start attacking him first. Like most open world enemies, being mounted on Torrent feels easier to me as I can dip in and out as I please, and with him having Deathblight as a signature trait, I think this was intended. I have just noticed that the enemies that are endemic within the Altus Plateau are some of From Software's better looking enemy models in terms of their art direction. I think this is why Altus is to this very day my favorite open world zone in the game. It's a tight toss up between this and Limgrave. I usually oscillate between the two. I think both of these are From Software at some of their peak work, and the dungeon design really encapsulates that my thought process with these two areas being the best in the entire game. When I think about these two areas and a few others, I still cannot deny my thoughts that I had after Shadow of the Erdtree's release, and it's that I want more open world Souls. I am not burnt out on open world Souls, and I don't think From Software's first open world was a failure. During my playthroughs of Shadow of the Erdtree, I did not like Commander Gaius that much. I felt like his mount was so much more powerful than Torrent, and it may have shooed players away from actually using Torrent within his fight. I still stand by that, and I also think From Software did a poor job at communicating that Torrent is more than just a movement speed mod in combat. Using Torrent in the open world is sometimes a bit of a chore. It's very easy for enemies to stunlock you into being staggered off of Torrent, alongside a few other issues players complain about, such as no iframes and horse combat being pretty one-dimensional. With those two things being said, and you having all of your tools available to you while off Torrent, I feel like From Software did a pretty poor job of implementing him within boss fights. With that being said though, Torrent feels too strong here. I know, you probably did not expect that, and neither did I. I never used Torrent in combat during my multiple Elden Ring playthroughs. I would dismount myself from Torrent and fight the boss traditionally. Using Torrent here almost feels like the Godskin Apostle we fought a little while back. The Tree Sentinel feels like he's designed to fight the player without a mount. It feels a little bit better than the Godskin, but that's not saying that much. It was still nearly effortless to dodge most of his attacks by simply sprinting throughout the large play zone. Add on the fact that you can weave in and out for a slow and steady kill, makes Torrent feel like the best way to take this guy down. I don't have an issue with this, and I have to say that I kind of like it. However, I still wish that Torrent was more involved in Elden Ring. Fighting this enemy while not mounted is one of my favorite non-Runebearer bosses in the game. He has a great mixture of what Tree Sentinel has while adding even more with his spells and fireball attack from his mount. I would go as far to say that he is one of the more complex enemies in the entire game, and that's impressive saying that, again, he's not a Remembrance boss, nor is he a Runebearer boss. Honestly, I like him more than Malenia, and because of that, I don't think I have any complaints with this guy when you're fighting him normally. Let me just rip the band-aid off and spoil something for you. I am going to rant about Godskin Duo. I think they're terribly lazy and they're almost as bad as Duo Guardian Ape. However, I kind of like these two. I know it's kind of odd, but these two and Godskin Duo have a lot in common, but I enjoy these two. I've always enjoyed fighting multiple enemies at once, and if you've been following this series, you've heard that before. Godskin Duo got a lot wrong, and I will rant about them when the time comes. And while yes, these two do not have movesets that are designed to work together, it's really not hard to see, mainly because one of the AI is aggressive while the other sits back and watches the 1v1 play out like a gentleman. I get that. It works for me. It's a nice challenge even if it is a 1v1 for the most part. I do not mind these two enemies because they're not required to progress, and they feel a lot easier than the Godskin Duo ever did. I wish there was something slightly more creative than just two Crucible enemies in one room, but I can dig it. These two are very high quality assets, so fighting them back to back is not a chore. I prefer the Crucible Knight without the shield, as I find his attacks to have cooler looking animations, and he does not have a large shield that gets in the way. I like them. I think they're okay. Now, have we fought this enemy more than once by this point in the game? Absolutely. Yep, and if someone has somehow skipped this enemy, then they can fight him here for the first time, which is great. But what I really want to say here is that I think Elden Ring's reuse is completely fine pre-mountaintops. I actually take more issue with Sekiro's reuse because it felt like an obligation in that game. A lot of the mini-bosses in that game would drop the precious prayer beads that are so pivotal to the Sekiro experience. The act of raising your HP is quite fun, don't get me wrong, but there's at least a real and tangible reward at the end of these catacomb dungeons. And that's why I think Elden Ring's reuse generally isn't that big of an issue. I do have some issues with it, and we'll talk about it, but things like this catacomb is just one out of the many examples of reuse done well. If there was no extrinsic reward at the end of the dungeons, then maybe I would complain, if it only dropped runes, for example. But that's not the case. So yes, we have done this enemy before, and adding in the pot enemies is just a way to make it feel slightly more unique. But the mystery of what this reward will be at the end of the catacomb makes it worth it. And for the Grave Warden Duelist himself, you already know what I think about him. I think he has a pretty well-designed moveset. That doesn't mean I think that his catacomb is good, because I really don't. But fighting him is fun, if you allow him to flash what he is capable of. In regards to the Grave Warden Duelist, I said that the reused asset that he is can sit well with me. I think he has enough interesting things going on to warrant fighting him multiple times. Now that I have done this playthrough of Elden Ring, I think my conclusion is that the Tree Spirit enemies are my least favorite mini-boss in the game, and I don't really know if I want to do them anymore. And this can lead into the issue of wanting to skip the Tree Spirit enemies. Someone could, in theory, skip them as they are completely optional, but I have noticed that with Elden Ring, these enemies have a tendency to drop a golden seed that will upgrade your healing flask. This extrinsic reward is so powerful that it has the same issue with Sekiro and reuse, and it's that you will feel obligated to kill them because they will make your character significantly more powerful. However, in defense of Elden Ring, these enemies are far easier than most Sekiro mini-bosses, but they're also really annoying. Mainly because Elden Ring offers you so many tools to effectively nerf the boss in question, but I cannot deny, I still don't really like these enemies that much. They are poorly designed by concept. 9 times out of 10, really large enemies such as this or the fire giants simply do not work that well with Elden Ring's camera. This is demonstrably seen, as it is very common for your camera to whip around uncontrollably or even clip through the enemy boss model. That's not to mention that this enemy is also arena dependent, as the Tree Spirit itself has a tendency to clip through the environment, making for an even worse experience. I like some of the ideas of this enemy. I think he looks interesting, but the camera issues and constant clipping is flat out unacceptable. From Software rarely missed with Elden Ring's enemies, so I can give this one a pass, but I think they knew he had issues, but they just kind of liked what he did enough to justify throwing him into the game. The Crucible Knight is a simple but effective Knight type enemy by Elden Ring standards, but that's the key word, Elden Ring standards. It really is easy to take for granted how good of a game that Elden Ring really is. When you put in a couple hundred hours into the game, the flaws of the game aren't hard to point out. And sometimes we tend to focus too much on the negative of something we love because the rest is so fucking good. And we feel it's just a few inches away from being perfect. I think this is a part of the reasoning as to why some people can become quick to defend Elden Ring or even something like Rockstar games. There are fanboys that will attack anyone who hates on the game. I've definitely seen them, but there's definitely people that I've seen that will always rush to defend these games because they are close to masterpieces, or they are masterpieces. I don't think attacking or name calling is ever justified, but I can understand the sentiment of trying to focus on the good instead of the bad. And that's what I'm going to try and do here. I just got done shitting on the Tree Spirit, so we can go to the opposite side here and praise the Crucible Knight because he's really fucking good. His first phase is rather simple, but in a way that works. He really kicks online when he grows these wings and he uses a new tail whip attack in his combos, making him more than just a standard sword and shield enemy. I like him a lot, and if I were to throw this exact AI into Dark Souls 1, for example, he would probably be one of the better bosses in the entirety of that game. Definitely in the top 6 or 7 bosses. Radahn reaches the highs of an amazing From Software boss in all the best ways that a Souls fan would expect. It's evident that From Software wanted players to enjoy the boss's gameplay, build-up, and story. We all know that From Software is quite notorious for their esoteric storytelling style. Radahn does have this, but he also takes a little bit from Sekiro where things are directly told to you. There are definitely a lot of people that play these games and the story goes completely over their head, including me. From Software does not care if you don't understand why you are fighting certain enemies or if you understand what is going on through the environment and the main story. It is a unique form of storytelling, no doubt, and it works for them. There's no denying any of this. With Radahn, they wanted you to become invested in his character and fight. Not only was he hyped up in the very first trailer of Elden Ring when you see him versus Malenia, but his friend also hypes up the festival and the NPCs hype up Radahn to be this super big and epic guy. It worked really well, and it doesn't just work on the story front, as we're going to get to the gameplay side of things for now. Something that I really dislike about Elden Ring is how difficulty is handled, but also I like how it's handled. It's kind of a double-edged sword, and I promise I am not trying to be coy. Funnily enough, we are going to talk about this exact same thing when we fight Radahn 2 in Shadow of the Erdtree. But for how I enjoy Elden Ring's difficulty, it's that everyone has to deal with the boss that From Software intended since they were designed in a certain way. You don't get to nerf the bosses or even remove some of their bullshit mechanics like waterfowl. Every single person is on the same playing field, but how you deal with certain boss attacks will vary. If you are wondering, Miyazaki talked about this directly and he said, quote, "We do not want to include a difficulty selection because we want to bring everyone to the same level of discussion and the same level of enjoyment. So we want everyone to first face the challenge and to overcome it in some way that suits them as a player." I don't have an issue with what Miyazaki said here. It's part of why I love Souls games, and I think he's right. From Software designs a complex boss, and how players handle it is up to them. Every single one of us could look up a guide and find the best build to slaughter the game, but we would also be so overleveled with stats and power that it would dilute the game into a piss-poor experience because we like to have a bit of a challenge. And finding a build that makes you a super god anime warrior isn't fun for some of us because we like that challenge. It's part of why we play these games, isn't it? What I do not like about Elden Ring's difficulty is that, at times, it can be too hard. I know that some From Software fans hearing it's too hard can lead to a lot of backlash towards the person that said that, but just hear me out. I understand why so many people push back versus people that say these games are too hard. People have tried time and time and again to take away the difficulty of these games, and when we hear people talk about the difficulty and shout that there needs to be an easy mode, sometimes they can get overly defensive. I do get all of that, but if Shadow of the Erdtree proved one thing, it's that From Software is not perfect at balancing. I will get into that with Radahn too, but it's not just Shadow of the Erdtree. Since Elden Ring is so large and From Software always tries to one-up themselves with the boss complexity and difficulty, there can be times where it feels like the game is peaked, and it's close to breaking with how far it's been pushed. Yes, Waterfowl, and yes, the original Triple Slash. I think those moves are too hard and far too punishing for what they are. And if someone tries to express their distaste for those moves, they sometimes get bombarded with hate, or the other person says, "Nuh-uh, just summon," or the famous "get good." I don't think these arguments are always helpful. I will save the best for last, but not summoning in Elden Ring is more or less a challenge run when it really should not be. Summoning in the other games still required you to play well since it would buff the boss's HP. In Elden Ring, the pros of summoning far outweigh the loss of a one puny Estus flask. I do want to clarify that this is not a jab towards people who summon either. Summoning is in the game for a reason, but sometimes I feel like the middle ground between gruesomely hard that Elden Ring's bosses can be and making the boss less fun to play because you barely interacted with it wasn't balanced that well in Elden Ring. It's very easy to find a build that slaughters the game, but it's a lot harder to find a build that's in a nice middle ground if you feel like your build is too weak. Guides are commonly used for these games, and you will find hundreds of YouTube videos by typing in Elden Ring best build, but you will find close to zero guides by typing in Elden Ring build that is strong but not giga strong. Not only that, because most bosses are clearly designed to be fought in a 1v1 setting, since the boss itself is really good at focusing on one player, except for Radahn. I personally love this about Radahn, and it's one of the few bosses in the entirety of the series where summoning doesn't take away from the experience of actually fighting him. He feels more cinematic with summons. His story feels better to engage with summons, since he's such a big badass that needs an army to take him down. But because Radahn does a good job at having wide slashing area of effect moves that can target multiple people at once, it works really well here. This suits Radahn impeccably, so perfectly. And just as a quick note, Radahn is yet another reason as to why I am not worried about Elden Ring's Night Rain co-op experience. From Software has demonstrably shown that they can design a boss that works well with multiple people at once. And of course, this war-hardened badass is a boss arena the size of Florida. His stature and strength demand that size. He is not a little dude that will focus on dueling you. He is out to make a scene when he fights with how cool he is. From Software wants you to struggle here because that's part of the fun. How lame would it be if Radahn was hyped up to be this all-powerful strength bro that dies in a few hits? It would be very fucking lame. Very lame. And that right there is sadly my story. My story with Radahn. Radahn is the first bad memory that I had with Elden Ring. It's honestly a bit sad that it was Radahn, as he's everyone's favorite character, he's a strength bro, of course he's the best. But I made Radahn look like the Scarlet Rot completely took over him and I beat him into mulch. Really, what I'm saying in a convoluted way is that Elden Ring's open world simply caught up with me, and I am going to come out and say that it shouldn't have. Going open world means that something will be sacrificed, whether that be the brevity of a short and focused game, or maybe too much reuse, or even how easy it is to become over-leveled in an open world game. To be clear, I love open world games outside of Elden Ring. Elden Ring is simply put my favorite Souls game, so what I'm about to say doesn't mean that I want the open world to vanish away. But I beat Radahn on my first try. After I beat Godrick in Stormveil Castle, I left and went to Liurnia. I was quite confused about what Florida was supposed to be since I couldn't get to it, but I figured that it was just for show, as I went to the place where you meet your fellow festival enjoyers and I found a bad duo boss. Once I defeated that bad duo boss, I left and forgot about Florida. I don't use guides, so I didn't even know Radahn was supposed to be fought there. I just thought Caelid was empty. I'm not the only one who did this exact same thing. Never Knows Best has a wonderful video essay where he and I share the same experience of slaughtering Radahn with no pushback. This shouldn't happen, especially not with Radahn. If there is one character that you should not be able to vastly overlevel and wipe off the planet like Thanos snapped him, it is Radahn. I didn't even experience the surprise death when he Starscourges because I simply rolled it and I happened to not die. And with all of the rambling I have done regarding overleveling in Elden Ring, I still think that From Software should have matched the levels close to or directly matched enemy levels with you, so if you do overlevel them, this does not happen. I'll talk even more about similar ideas with the Golden Godfrey, kind of oddly enough, but this was a real punch in the gut. You'll know why as the video goes on, but as far as I see it, Radahn wasn't much harder than regular field bosses. And it really sucks because I feel like I have just experienced Radahn for the first time and Elden Ring is nearly 3 years old. Every other time I have played Elden Ring, it was more for the grind that I felt like I had to do. I had to level a fresh character for Shadow the Erdtree before that came out, so I did a strong build and yet again, slaughtered poor Radahn. But now that I have purposefully died a few times, looked back and studied my footage, Radahn is a really good boss. He's huge, he's epic, and I only wish I wasn't overleveled the very first time I fought him. I love how he's one of the few bosses in the entire base game where Torrent feels like more of an asset and not just a movement speed mod. I still think fighting him on Torrent can be a bit frustrating, but I guess that doesn't matter too much. While I didn't talk about Radahn too much mechanically, what I will say is that he's one of the better bosses in the game in terms of, well, everything. Story, mechanics, he has it all. It's just a shame that Shadow the Erdtree kind of makes him feel less special, since I know that I will be fighting a lesser version of him unless my opinion has drastically changed since they reworked him. I guess that's what I will ask you guys. While Radahn does have a brand new kit in Shadow the Erdtree, I still see him as Radahn, and I would have rather fought something else. Killing him here didn't give me gratification because of the fact that he has a round 2. Does anyone feel the same way, or am I alone in this? I'll have to let the comments tell me. So now that we are in the tiny legacy dungeon for Caelid, we can fight the Godskin Apostle without Torrent, and I have to say, he's one of my favorite mini-bosses From Software has designed. He may even be my favorite mini-boss that's not the 7 Deadly Spears in Sekiro. It really is a shame because he isn't reused as much as some of the other mini-bosses, and when he is reused, it's usually not done that well. This leads into the opinion that I have had for a while, and it's that all reuse is not the same. Like most things in life, there are good and bad ways to do things, reuse included. Something like Godskin Duo, funnily enough, is an example of poor reuse, but Genichiro, on the other hand, is the epitome of good reuse. Before we talk about his mechanics, I do want to mention the black orb that he will throw at you. I don't know the mechanical answer to this, but I do remember that when Elden Ring came out, people would always use this boss as the example as to Elden Ring's boss button readings that they will do, and that is kind of an unfun way to interact with the game. Most of the time that you do use your heal here, the Godskin will throw his fireball. I don't have much of an issue with this as it doesn't make the fight feel unfair, but it's also a little reminder that I am playing a video game in what is supposed to be a fun, intense moment. But that's enough of that. This guy is really good and I want to talk about him just a little bit more. There's always a certain appreciation that I have as a From Software fan. I've been playing these games back to back, and seeing a boss like this who isn't even a remembrance boss is a good way for From Software to demonstrate how far they've come. Godskin Apostle Apostle is even better than most Dark Souls 3 main game bosses in terms of mechanics. Phase 1 is him wielding his scythe-looking weapon with finesse, but Phase 2 adds more style into the fight that I enjoy. His power-up transition adds black magic, and he can extend his limbs to have more range with his attacks. And as far as I can tell, he doesn't have any extensions to his main combos that I would have liked to see. But I think for what it is, it's an all-around very well done fight. Maybe a hot take, not too sure, but the Godskin Apostle is better than the Fat Godskin, and I'm not afraid to say it. Like most of the dragon reuses that are in Elden Ring, they're better at filling out the world and reminding the player that this is a dangerous world. You are playing a From Software game, and you will never be in a peaceful setting where the good guys always win. It's part of what I love about From Software, and I think the dragons do a good job at reinforcing that idea. The dragon moveset itself is not bad, like I said with Agheel, but I've without a doubt had my fill. I can at least say that the Glintstone variation has a few new moves, or at least I think they're new, with the fire attacks having a pretty blue hue to them instead of the basic fire breath. I can't say more than that, the reuse is nothing special beyond that. As we all know, the Souls games are an iterative series. These games do not radically recreate themselves with each release. The closest we have ever seen the radical swing with the formula was, of course, Sekiro. In the past Souls games, the go-to way to fight large enemies with a gap underneath them was to simply stand beneath the enemy and whack at it. The AI wasn't always well equipped to handle what you were doing. Sometimes it could, but it was mainly with the enemy repositioning and not as much with what moves it could do. And that's where Bulse, the Carrion Knight, comes into play. Big Boy Bulse, who I will just nickname BBB, has AoE slam attacks that stop the player from simply attacking his legs beneath his crotch, and has wide sweeping moves on top of that. Again, just like the past bosses in this video, the Souls series may have started out a bit rough, but From Software never gave up, and they continue to refine their craft into what it is today. And yeah, BBB is not this amazing fight that will go down as one of my favorite bosses ever made, but when you know the history of the Souls games, you can look at BBB and see that, wow, even a little boss like this really shows how far From Software has come. And as a fan of these games, that means a lot to me. And it may even birth a new question that I've never asked myself. Will I look back at Elden Ring in a decade from now when we're all in our 30s and say, wow, these guys are really, really simple, because now we have this? I don't know, but I'm excited to see if it does. If you have played Bloodborne, then the Spirit Caller Snail may feel familiar because it's another take on the Witches of Hemwick from that game. The Witches of Hemwick in Bloodborne are no doubt the weakest boss in the entire game. The boss arena is bland, the gimmick isn't fun, and you've seen enemies that are present in that boss arena before. I usually find something good with these kind of bosses when From Software does something similar to this, but in this case, this is just another catacomb. That's kind of how bad it is. If you really, and I mean really, want to skip this boss as quickly as possible, the location of the snail has a light where it's located, so the snail itself is very, very squishy and very, very easy to see. And because of all of that, this is one of the easiest bosses in the entire game. So I'm almost certain that the Omen Killer boss is the Capra Demon from Dark Souls 1 with a slightly extended moveset. They look similar, they have the exact same weapons, and some of the animations look straight up ripped from Dark Souls 1. This is how you properly utilize the past work that you've done and shove it into a new game. If I am right, and the Omen Killer is just what I said, an updated Capra Demon, then I would say that they did a really good job, and this is inoffensive in every way possible. This enemy isn't bad, it's slightly updated, and it fills out the world. I can go on for hours about proper and improper use, but I've done a lot of that and will be doing more in the future. Well, it's another rematch with this enemy, and I still have to say that this Bloodhound Knight isn't an enemy that I find that interesting. I do enjoy that the cave he was placed in looks more interesting than what you would expect to see from a cave. However, whatever he has surrounding him does not make me enjoy fighting him whatsoever. There's no doubt that you know my opinion on Elden Ring's reuse by now, and it's that all reuse is not the same. We all know why Elden Ring had the reuse that it does, and it's the sort of thing where you have to take the good with the bad. The thing is, once you fight this enemy more than once, you will realize that the steer is a rather boring fight, and once the pretty colors and atmosphere lose its luster, it becomes rather bland. I don't really take offense to that, and at worst I would say that the second time you fight this enemy, it's just entirely forgettable. I guess my real disappointment comes with how lame I think Nokron is. If this boss was more enjoyable and memorable, then I could set my issues to the side, but with an area that I think is lame and a boss that no longer excites me, I fail to have much to say in terms of positivity. Whatever other issues that I have, the Ancestor Spirit is such a forgettable Remembrance boss that I always forget the fact that it is a Remembrance boss, and when I have settled on what I really think, I feel like having just one of these would have been plenty. Unlike the Ancestor Spirit, I think the Dragonkin enemies are fun to fight multiple times, and I don't really have an issue with From Software spreading them throughout the game. The only real issue I have with this enemy itself is that I always attack it close to its crotch, and there is no hurt box where I'm attacking, making it so I always whiff a few attacks. Not fun, but the enemy itself is pretty good. Elden Ring is the type of game where you have to take the good with the bad. It's just how it is. Throughout this video, I have made my thoughts abundantly clear in regards to Elden Ring's reused assets. The thing is, there's only so much you can do when it comes to defending something, as every line can be crossed. And I think that this is the case with these gargoyles. I am the kind of person that dislikes a game such as Dark Souls 2 for poor level design and a lot of bad bosses. What I do enjoy with Dark Souls 2 is the enemy spam that is persistent in that game. There are times when it goes way too overboard. The lowest hanging fruit would be the runbacks to some of those god-awful DLC bosses, but throughout the vast majority of the game, I like what Dark Souls 2 did, regardless of whatever the other person may say. But the duo gargoyles are the antithesis to what a good duo boss is. And it's so sad because when I look at this boss arena, it's beautiful. The first time I got to the boss arena, I was expecting something really epic, as the boss arena is downright beautiful. But my excitement quickly dwindled the longer the fight went on. What I really dislike about Elden Ring more than anything else is that it's the death of a good duo boss. From Software absolutely dropped the ball on making one single good duo boss, and I will rant to the heavens about it until the end of time, because Godskin Duo and these guys are not good. They're really, really bad. Catacomb dungeons feel deliberately designed to be easy, and since it is common for someone to find a duo in a catacomb, I usually don't care, as it never feels like something From Software wanted players to struggle on, and if they did, maybe it's just for 10 minutes max, absolute max. These two, however, are not that, and they are strong opponents to deal with. What makes this thing even worse with these two is that From Software essentially knows that this is a terrible boss with two enemies that shouldn't be fought together, since they give you plenty of time to wail on one of the gargoyles, as players can quickly burst one of them down and turn the fight into a 1v1. All you have to do is fight these two together, and you will quickly realize how miserable these two are, since they weren't designed to work together. They were just two enemies thrown together because From Software needed to reuse an asset. The problem with these two harkens back to some of the oldest duo bosses, and at times, their attacks will overlap, which will sometimes get the player overly frustrated, and they will just turn their gameplay style into a hit trading style. And if they do not rely on hit trading, they may just hopelessly run around hoping that the AI will be gracious enough to allow them to play the game. There's so much more that I could say, and I will save some of it for Godskin Duo, but the rotten cherry that is this boss and Godskin Duo is that Elden Ring gives new players a bad impression on what duo bosses are, and shoves them into the idea of relieving all of their issues with summoning. I do not want to come off as rude when I say this, but there are a lot of people that will say the Souls combat system is only designed for 1v1 fights, and it's not well equipped to handle more than one enemy at any given moment. And to that I say, no. That's an asinine statement. All you have to do is play a real duo boss in one of From Software's past games, and you will see how fun those fights really are. Moreover, since From Software wants you to have a challenge, and they also want you to have elevated feelings when they eventually overcome a foe that they were previously stuck on, having summons be as strong and as powerful as they are can really go against that, since summoning is such an easy answer to every single issue that you will have in this game. The past Souls games made the bosses tankier when you summon, a far worse trade-off than what one flask is in Elden Ring. And on top of that, I feel like Elden Ring handled difficulty in the worst way possible when compared to every other From Software game. The game can be excessively hard when you are not summoning and using a one-shot build that you found on YouTube. From Software clearly just didn't care, or they didn't think about how frustrating bosses are that are haphazardly thrown into one boss room for solo players. If you are good enough, you will win. I did, and I also went against the Godskin Duo every single time, but it's just not fun. And it's so blatantly obvious to anyone who doesn't summon that this is not fun. I struggled on Kenichiro for more than 5 hours when I first played Sekiro. That was fun. It's some of my all-time funnest moments with Souls. I had to build a map inside my head when I was playing Dark Souls 1 so I could properly navigate the first half of that game. That's also a fun form of difficulty. I died to these two for maybe 30 minutes on my first playthrough of Elden Ring, and yet it was a miserable experience, and it's one of the worst memories I have with the game. People that enjoy Elden Ring's lore and story more than I do probably appreciate fighting Thea's champions more than I do as well. When I am fighting them, I see them as nothing more than simple phantom invaders that are a bit of a nuisance. I think that Shadow of the Erdtree did this a lot better, since the story NPCs that you fight at the end of the DLC were better implemented into the story, so fighting them at the very end made it more memorable, for me at least. I also would not be surprised if the NPCs that you are fighting here are just regular invaders that you will see in base game Elden Ring. Crucible Knight Siluria will be the last Crucible Knight that we will be seeing for some time now, and I must say that I think From Software did a great job at using these assets wisely. There was not a single time that I rolled my eyes and sighed at the enemy, and even if I did with this Crucible Knight, you do get a pretty cool armor set as a reward. And just like the open world Godskin, using Torrent here felt like I activated an easy mode, and he went down without me breaking a sweat. And just like with our last Crucible Knight, this will be our last Dragonkin enemy that we will be fighting for the time being. From Software opted opted to add an environmental hazard for players to deal with, or they can stand on the platforms next to the boss itself. There's not much to really say about these reuses as none of them are offensive, and I don't think that this enemy is a nuisance to fight. I think that Estelle works on multiple levels, and it's not just about him being a pretty good fight. The Souls games aren't really well known for being the type of RPGs that offer radically different boss fights depending on your choices, and I can happily say that Elden Ring kind of dabbled with that idea, and FromSoftware hit a pretty good middle ground. The bosses that FromSoft locked off depending on what story choices you made in the past games were Gehrman, Moon Presence, Emma, and Ishin, and Elden Ring gave us Fortisax plus Estelle. There may be a few more that I'm simply not remembering, these were just off the top of my head, and someone could easily argue that the last third of Sekiro's bosses are all entirely optional since the game can end with Emma and Ishin if you choose the bad ending. But I digress. We all know that FromSoftware intended for you to do the good ending on your first playthrough of Sekiro. With Estelle being one of the optional bosses depending on your ending of choice, I think he hits the perfect middle ground that FromSoftware was never able to meet. Gehrman is somewhat similar to the bad ending in Sekiro, where most players will want to fight him if they've gone that far, and Moon Presence doesn't really have an AI attached to him. I do remember fighting him during my recent Bloodborne playthrough, and he felt like he was an unfinished Chalice Dungeon enemy because Chalice Dungeons are really fucking bad, and he doesn't look like shit like damn near every Chalice Dungeon model. So with that convoluted explanation of Estelle out of the way, I think at worst he's a good demonstration of an optional and easily missed story boss. I am glad that FromSoftware chose a minor boss and not a boss that was clearly given a lot of development time, such as Godfrey for example. This is FromSoftware not really punishing players for not using a guide, as we all know that the quests in these games are very esoteric and most players will have to use a guide. I know for a fact that I never would have completed a lot of Soulsborne content without the usage of a guide. Another noteworthy thing that should be pointed out is how good he looks while fitting within the Elden Ring world and not looking out of place. Within FromSoftware's dark fantasy worlds, we have seen our fair share of the expected. Armored knights and dragons are littered throughout the lands between, and having something as different as Estelle is a welcome addition. I think FromSoftware even leaned into his looks, as he is the type of boss that looks better than he plays, similar to Nokron as a whole. That's not to suggest that he is bad, he isn't, but how he is animated and how he moves is different from what we are used to in Elden Ring. The vast majority of what he does is filled with ostentatious colors and moves and grabs. It's clear that he was intentionally designed to grab your attention with how he was artistically designed more than anything else. It's why I have never really had an issue with Matir and Shadow the Erdtree. Not every boss needs to be this mechanical masterpiece, and I am glad FromSoftware agrees with me. And even though Estelle or Matir are the furthest thing from a complex and mechanical boss, that's not to suggest they have no mechanics. Estelle has a lot of attacks with range that he can use and utilize with his lanky body, making it so you have to understand how to fight in a mid-range position versus Estelle, because you really can't stand underneath him. His body is so abstract and irregular, which made standing underneath him never really end well for me. So I have to say he's fine, he's not a bad boss. I don't want to hop on Elden Ring just to play him, but for what he is, he's pretty good. So I find that these pretty flower enemies that we see in Elden Ring are unique enough to justify having them as just a little boss at the end of a catacomb. That's kind of it, really. Their moves are super simple, but as a world enemy shoved into a catacomb, they work well enough for me to make it so that it's not much of a chore. I'm just going to come out and say it. I really like this boss. I think that it hits the highs of what an epic and over-the-top boss should be. I kind of forgot how cool and interesting the Dragonkin enemy is, mainly because it's been about a year since I fought him. The first half of his HP bar is on the simple side, it's more of what I've seen before, but once he hits the second phase, the epic notch gets turned up to 10. How this enemy moves around while he's in the air, or how he yields electricity unlike the other Dragonkin enemies, well, it all just works really well here. It's the grand culmination of this enemy, and I couldn't be more positive about him. What I enjoy the most, though, is how the camera somewhat zooms out when he is doing his impressive acrobatic moves. He's one of the enemies that I would give a very solid BAM A grade, and if you threw me into a game such as Dark Souls 3 right this moment, he would even be an S tier boss in that game. Call me stupid, but I didn't realize that there were two different abductor type enemies until FromSoftware forced me to. The concept of this boss is simple. We throw the two abductor enemies into one boss arena and have players battle it out. It's not really hard to understand, and even when I was playing this boss for the very first time ever, Elden Ring as a whole was just so large and I was just so out of it that I didn't realize that I was fighting both variations of this enemy at once. I'm sure that there are other enemy variations that I simply have not caught on to, and maybe that's a hidden gem within Elden Ring. This game is so large and complex that someone could miss something simple like I have missed here. And when this finally clicked for me, I realized that I think the wheel abductor is slightly more interesting to fight than the one with the sickle. And I think that this encounter with a tree spirit enemy is really where it shines the brightest. It's an open field such as this, you have as much space as you need to match the overall movement and tempo that these enemies bring to the table. That's all without mentioning that these enemies are, at least for me, notorious for clipping in and out of walls and level terrain. That's simply not possible here, and I think that this Tree Spirit is probably the best one in the entirety of Elden Ring. The issue that I have with this Kindred of Rot boss fight is that the two enemies you are fighting are fodder enemies, if you will. Nothing makes these enemies interesting or fun to fight because their overall stats are very, very low. They function well in the open world with their long range and overall disgusting artistic design, but that's all these two kind of have. Other Catacomb enemies that we have fought have well-designed movesets, or they have a large HP pool to at least demand that the player puts in a little bit of effort for their reward. Here, we have none of that, making this one of, if not the worst Catacomb in Elden Ring. It really probably is. So yeah, worst Catacomb in Elden Ring. This Magma Wyrm may look like another box standard reuse. I find myself always looking forward to this boss on each of my playthroughs. Seeing this Magma Wyrm rise from the lava, and how the same lava he was burrowed in is an environmental hazard that works really well. If you ask me, this is where the Magma Wyrm enemy was always intended to be used initially. From Software just designed the asset and had to stretch it, but I also think that they did a good enough job at using that asset well in other places throughout the open world. I still enjoy the time that I've spent with the demi-human enemies here. From Software even threw in a few enemies from Raya Lucaria. Not sure what their presence really means, but it does make for a fresher feeling encounter. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think I've even seen some Elden Ring Night Rain gameplay with this exact enemy as one of the bosses, so I guess we'll be seeing more of it. The Red Wolf enemy is still pretty good. Not great, but good enough. But with this being a Catacomb boss, I don't think that it carries the luster that it had in Raya Lucaria. I would say that it's still worth fighting like most Catacomb bosses, but mainly for the extrinsic reward you get at the end, and then you can skedaddle back to the open world and the fun parts of Elden Ring. If there is one thing that this entire area next to the Volcano Mare doesn't get enough credit for, it's proper usage of open world boss placement. Every bit of atmosphere in this area plays really well with the bosses that From Software decided to use here, which in turn makes the bosses more memorable for me personally. Even an enemy that I have never been fond of, such as the Falling Star Beast, it becomes more engaging with its larger boss arena and the atmosphere that I mentioned earlier. I almost want to say that I kind of liked fighting him here. I also just really enjoyed his second phase more than I remembered. Seeing his gravity lift and the spells that he does makes for an enemy that isn't just a rampaging beast, such as the Blazing Bull in Sekiro. The first time I played Elden Ring, I was stuck on this guy for a while, and I really mean that. I had to sink some time into this enemy as I came here entirely under-leveled. I think that I was simply becoming fatigued and frustrated by this guy's moveset. But with a fresh set of eyes, I kind of like the boss placement here. I do want to say that I think the Godskin Noble is an all-around a pretty good boss. I think that I lean towards liking the other Godskin more, but they're both equally great. What I don't understand as a whole with these two is how they aren't reused as much as the other enemies in Elden Ring. At this point, yeah, I am asking for more reuse. These two are a high-quality asset that could have been stretched before the Godskin Duo, and they could have even cut Godskin Duo for a better reuse with these two. Regardless, both of the Godskin enemies have attacks where they expand their body and use their extended limbs, or in this case, the Godskin Noble's extra padding. Of course, his for fun move is the Blubber Roll, and I've always found this move to feel uninteractive but kind of funny. When I am trying to play optimally, I usually hide behind one of the pillars like how someone would in the Ornstein and Smo boss fight. The other Godskin didn't really have this issue since he would have larger sweeping moves with his body extensions. I don't think that matters much, but both of the Godskin enemies are very well done if I had to say so myself. They look more interesting than basic fantasy knights, they have cool moves, the whole shebang, you get it by now. Simply put, Rykard is a boss that feels good to fight. What someone enjoys with certain bosses will vary from person to person of course, but I think that Rykard is the only boss in the Souls combat system that actually feels good to fight. So that's a bit odd, and now I have to elucidate why I think he feels good to play and fight against. The simplest way I can put it is to kind of relate it to Bloodborne. You know when you hop on Bloodborne and you're not exactly sure on what weapon you want to use, so you use a few, you find out which ones you don't want to use, you even look up a YouTube video to see all the weapons, but part of the magic of Bloodborne is using that weapon and even finding that weapon. And that's kind of what Rykard does here. Even though you don't find the weapon, it's just given to you for the most part. Still, I have to say that it feels good to use a melee ranged weapon. Most melee weapons don't do that, but this one does. There's something so gripping and fascinating with this weapon, and hitting the snake just feels good. I think that goes a long way here. The past bosses with this gimmick don't really reach the highs of Rykard. Yorn is the worst defender since he's so fucking boring, but I think that the Storm King in Demon Souls never fails because of its atmosphere. But it kind of feels like From Software combined the two past fights here into what I would call the perfected version of this gimmick fight. The atmosphere is slightly less interesting than Demon Souls, but the mechanics are a lot better than what we saw in Dark Souls 3. The only disappointing aspect with this boss is that it's more of a for fun boss, while also being a snake. I have been asking for a stern and unrelenting snake boss fight for some time now, and I wouldn't say that those words would describe Rykard. Phase 2 is a dramatic shift in a lot of welcoming ways though. Something that I will talk about the further we go on in Elden Ring is that it has too many two-phased bosses. Nearly every single boss in this game is a two-phased boss, and they also have one health bar. With the sheer amount of its bosses, Elden Ring never tried to play the gotcha card. There is not a single main boss in Elden Ring that ever got me. Genichiro, Sister Frieda, Guardian Ape, and a few others tried to play that card, and it was usually pretty successful. From Software did not try this with Rykard. I do appreciate how there are 2 full health bars that I have to dig through. Most bosses are predictable in that manner. Rykard is not. And once the boss has reached roughly half HP, you get a new phase, and for me, this became very predictable. So I must say that I appreciate how Rykard feels slightly unique because of the simple 2 full health bars. Phase 2 really brings in the King of the Storm aspect where this guy turns the atmosphere up a few notches. Rykard's second phase is trying to be loud and garish. Simply put, there's a lot going on here, and it may not be for the best. There was a trade-off that From Software most likely internally made, and it's not something everyone will love, and it's with the Skull Summon. I think that the skulls are overall a welcome addition, and I wouldn't remove them if given the option, but I also cannot deny that they would sometimes just get in the way, and I was being swarmed with multiple of them on my screen, making Rykard's attacks sometimes hard to see. Not being able to see what's going on my screen isn't fun, and it's probably not fun for most people. I will say that I tested the Skull Summon a few times, and about half of the time I would say that the skulls felt obtrusive. The only way I can think to fix this would be to give the weapon an ultra great sword moveset so players can kill the skulls after 1 or 2 hits. Although, I digress. The skulls aren't that big of an issue, and I don't think that they add more than a light annoyance to an all-around pretty good boss. I like Ilmer the Briar a decent amount, even if he is a relatively standard duel by Elden Ring standards. He has one gimmick. He's not over-designed. He's simply a duelist fight for the end of the swamp surrounding him. I think the act of finding this area and him are parts of the boss fight for me. and it's why I enjoy him just a little bit more. And it's rewarding as well. He kind of encapsulates what I said earlier with Godrick, and it's that having something strong, like his delayed attacks, is what makes a boss fight more memorable. I don't think Ilmer has anything that stands out besides his weapon throw, which makes him kind of forgettable by the time I leave his boss room. I sadly don't have much else to say about him besides, he's a standard duel. Even though this dragon is a cut and paste moveset of the dragons that are littered throughout Caelid, I still had some enjoyment with this dragon only because of the sheer fact that I had not been in Caelid for some time now. I guess this dragon reminded me of the important lesson that a fresh atmosphere is good and it's important. He's one of the harder dragons in the overworld, and a lot of people will skip a few of these dragons only to come back to them at a later point, which does make for some memorable moments that you can have with the game. Despite the fact that I don't hate these enemies, I find these two to be quite forgettable. There's nothing wrong with stretching the assets that you have made here, but with these two having the extra fortification on their hurt boxes, I found that fighting them to be something of a slog. I do not find them offensive because they are relatively easy and not a main boss, but I still find the dual pumpkin heads to be mostly forgettable. And wow, this is another dragon reuse, but guess what? I think that what I said earlier about Caelid's dragons stands true. All of these dragons are to flesh out the world and make Caelid feel as menacing as it is. This is asking a lot as Elden Ring is such a huge game, but I think a happy medium could have been met if there were 2 dragon movesets to fight in Caelid. I understand why this isn't the case, as getting a functioning dragon moveset is probably quite hard. It's easy to forget that we used to live in a world where dragons were a mixed bag in quality, but this is Elden Ring, and having 2 dragon movesets that are as good as the Agheel moveset would have gone a long way. The Night Cavalry on paper has a simple moveset, but I think they are an appreciated welcome because they are nocturnal. I am sure Elden Ring's open world plays with light and dark enemies in more ways than I can list off, but the addition that From Software put into Elden Ring is what makes this kind of thing memorable. As I said, his moveset is really simple. I tried knocking him off of his horse, but he chose to quickly resummon it each time I did. Whether his off-mounted moveset wasn't developed enough, or I simply got RNG that wasn't very good, I don't really know. When this is all said and done, he does feel like an exact cut and paste of the Tree Sentinel, so I assume his moveset while unmounted wasn't really developed. During this encounter with a Deathward enemy, I accidentally made this boss feel entirely unique, and it's now an indelible moment with the Souls games in my mind. This encounter felt like an open world battle royale since I had the trolls aggroed on the Deathbird and myself. I don't think From Software meant for this to happen. I mean, maybe they did, but this is an instance where throwing enemies into a brawl made for a better and more intense outcome, because a 1v1 versus the Deathbird has always kind of thrown me off. I'm not saying it's too fast, but by God, this enemy feels like it's the fastest enemy in the game. It's almost so fast that I never really found the enemy that fun to fight. So forcing something more unique made this Deathbird the funnest time I've ever had with this enemy. Catacombs in Elden Ring aren't that remarkable in the base game, and I don't think many will deny that. However, From Software usually places enemies in Catacombs that feel like actual enemies. The scaly Misbegotten enemy in the overworld is usually seen paired with other enemies because it's a fodder enemy. It's meant to die with no real pushback, making him one of the worst Catacomb enemies that can be placed as a boss. Other Catacomb bosses are usually good enough to justify them being a boss, even if they really aren't that good like the Falling Star Beast, but I can live with most of them. This guy, well, he kind of just died and he offers no real challenge for any player. Even though I am doing Commander O'Neill relatively late for this playthrough, I always have a burst of nostalgia whenever I fight him because he was one of my more fond memories during my first playthrough of Elden Ring. I was stuck on him for more than a few deaths, and my eventual kill was one of those lucky kills where you had 0 flasks left with 1 HP. I was most definitely probably underleveled, but I like the brute force fights that I enjoy, and to this day, I still enjoy O'Neill. When you are properly leveled, he offers a different challenge that's not just a cool 1v1 fight since he has his summons to aid him, and I would go as far to say that this version of him is far better than the one that we will see in the mountaintops. His summons feel far less annoying since they are the weaker mobs, but in return, he has more that you have to deal with. I think the overall atmosphere and mood of Caelid also helps with him being more memorable. Overall, I'd say he's probably the strongest field boss in Caelid. So the golden version of Godfrey has been one big build-up, and it's been a long time coming. This very well may be the most important boss within my blind playthrough of Elden Ring. The playthrough where I didn't know what was around the corner, how much of the game I had left, or what the next area would be. And this boss, I hate to say it, it completely and entirely broke me. But as a quick note, the short and honest answer is that I rarely become tired and burnt out from the Souls games. Annoyances are one thing. Every Souls game has something that's annoying and maybe not perfect, but being entirely burnt out only happened during my first playthrough of Chalice Dungeons and Bloodborne because, of course, they're Chalice Dungeons, and, of course, the second playthrough of Chalice Dungeons for the Bloodborne video was even worse. Pondering on this memory is still puzzling to this very day, as we all know that the level prior to the boss may be the best in the entire game, but as soon as I saw Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, the game cracked and shattered because I understood what kind of animal Elden Ring is. I knew that I would be seeing this guy again. I knew that I had some time left with Elden Ring. I knew that there was more content that may be filler ahead of me. I understood Elden Ring's formula. Now, I just want to be clear, I have not lied to you about anything in this video. I do think that reuse is fine. I also think that most of the Catacomb enemies are somewhat fun, but that doesn't matter because that's not the real Elden Ring experience. The average Catacomb was an enemy that was entirely too easy and placed in an interior that looked samey, or another reuse, or the Radahn incident of over-leveling a boss so hard that he literally wasn't a boss anymore. I was growing tired of Elden Ring. Not only that, but I killed him suspiciously quickly. To this day, I don't really know if I was overleveled or not. I don't remember what my stats were, but I do know that I was also tired of playing a guessing game if I'm overleveled or not. I was simply put tired of the issues that I had with Elden Ring up to this point. This memory may also be exacerbated because Mountaintops comes next and Malenia isn't that far off. So, really, Elden Ring took a turn for the worst here, and this is why I have always said that Elden Ring's base game bosses are a mixed bag. If I garner every single boss in the game, I don't think it would be a pretty sight because of how many bosses I simply don't think are interesting to fight, even if I do understand why they need to exist. And that's why Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, is one of my least favorite bosses in the game. His moveset is obviously good, it's just phase 1 of Godfrey after all, but it's just predictable, and I knew what was going to be coming around the corner, so yeah. But all I remember is the feeling of emptiness. No joy, no elation. I was ready to get past what I had just defeated, and that's why everything in the base game after Godfrey just didn't feel the same. Nearly every Soulsborne game has what I would call unforgivable bosses. Bosses that have one or more fatal flaws. Flaws that really bring the boss quality down, regardless of what else it was trying to do. Morgott is not immune to this, and saying what I just said out loud is somewhat disappointing. Even though I think that the very beginning of Elden Ring may be its highest point, with Stormveil and Limgrave and Leyndell, Altus Plateau, they're all pretty much tied with quality when compared to the beginning of the game. What I am really saying is that I would probably like Leyndell and Altus more if I didn't have two back-to-back bad experiences with Elden Ring. I think that my first encounter with Godfrey was mostly specific to me, and what issues Morgott has probably are not specific to me. The underlying issue I have with Morgott and even other parts of Elden Ring is that, well, it's not that balanced. If there is any poor balance in Elden Ring, I would argue that it's usually the game being too hard. FromSoft's games are nothing if not difficult, so I can understand the balance of the game accidentally being poorly tuned to be too hard instead of too easy. The thing is, there is an example of everything, and Morgott is the best example in Elden Ring of a boss being entirely too easy. A boss being made easy in these types of games is expected. Not every boss needs to be on the level of Malenia because that would make everything an annoying brick wall. Having easier bosses such as the overworld bosses or even something like Deacons of the Deep in Dark Souls 3 is welcome. But Morgott's overall presentation and moveset makes me think that he shouldn't be this easy of a boss that's solely there for some fun and easy runes, because I think he has kind of, well, everything. When you purposefully handicap yourself and don't slaughter him, it feels like he has everything besides raw stats. He has great atmosphere, an amazing cutscene, he's not a piss poor reuse like we have seen in the past, and he's fast and aggressive as fuck. Elden Ring really pushed the overall speed of the game to the next level, and Morgott was designed with that speed. I almost feel like From Software wanted him to be a bloodbath of a fight because of how aggressive he is. He's really good at giving minimal downtime in his openings because he's really that fast. It feels like he has his hands around my neck because of all the things he can do that I simply cannot. Except, not all of what I said is true. That's just what I want to happen because it's so close. Really, Morgott is one of the easiest bosses in the game, even though he's one of the scariest on paper. He has low poise, low damage, and HP. It's like From Software over-designed his kit and simply forgot to add stats. Each time I have fought Morgott, the fight has been over before it even started. I can tank his hits with no issues, and his damage is so low that he is effectively hitting me with pebbles. I can go on about his low stats, but I think that killing him can take 2 minutes with a completely normal build says more than enough. I don't think From Software is stupid, I think the opposite. And if I try and think as to why his stats are so low, the only real conclusion that I can come to is that he is so fast and has so many combos, FromSoft must have thought that those qualities would have thrown players off enough to justify his low stats. Alas, I simply don't think that was the case here. It's simply too easy to steamroll him and ask yourself, where is that second health bar? I have my stats on the screen here since someone can reach a logical conclusion that I was simply over-leveled. With how many bosses that I have been doing, it wouldn't be hard to over-level, but as you can see, I am level 80, the recommended level. There's a lot more that could be said about Morgott, but as he stands, I think he's such a disappointment, and I don't want to go through the annoyance of a challenge run just to see what he's really like to fight with a proper challenge. Alas, after a disappointing boss with much potential that was Morgott, Elden Ring delivers us a gank fight with the Fell Twins. Even though these two are enemies that you will see more throughout the game, I think that the pitch black arena makes these guys engaging just because of that, and since we are reviewing the bosses, I took extra time fighting these guys so I can see more of their moves. Just like most enemies in Elden Ring, they have a lot more than you would expect. I had absolutely zero idea that this guy would coat his weapon for extra damage and shoot projectiles at you. It can be a bit too easy to steamroll most enemies in Elden Ring as we head into the late game, which is a real shame because I think a lot of the enemies had a lot of care put into their design. And welcome to the end game of Elden Ring. I don't think you'll love it here. As we enter Mountaintop of the Giants, the Black Blade Kindred flashes what the end game is all about. There is very little added to the overworld and a lot of reuse. I'm usually the kind of person that is okay with enemies to fill out the open world and make it feel more alive, but I feel like this is an instance where we didn't need an enemy in this exact location. We are just getting equipped and familiar with our new scenery, only for that to be taken away by an enemy we've seen half a dozen times by this point. The actual moves that Kindred has still have quality to them, but I think that this is just an instance of poor enemy placement. The Onyx Lord, however, is an enemy that I really enjoy. Maybe it's just been a moment since I last fought them, but I don't remember what this enemy was capable of, making him feel like a brand new enemy in Elden Ring. We've seen plenty of enemies with melee attacks in this game, it's not that special after a certain point. But his ranged attacks, though, do look interesting, and it was worth the time I spent not killing him just to view what he could do. His Meteor Strike, admittedly, isn't as cool as some of the other meteor showers I've seen, but it's still a neat little add-on. The ranged projectile had a timing that would always clip me at the end of my eye roll, and yeah, he's not that overly complex or anything, but he's probably something that most players decimate and then forget about. So a little appreciation for this guy can never hurt. The Spirit Color Snail in the Mountaintops is nothing more than a funny troll you get to sit through. Anyone who has paid attention up to this point in the game knew exactly what was coming. The lead up to the boss is spirits and snails, and just like we've seen before, killing the snails kills the spirits. Pretty easy stuff. So, when you see that you're going to be fighting the Godskin Apostle, you think, I've done this before, another round of easy stuff. But then he spawns the other Godskin enemy, and things might get a little bit more tense. But at the end, you know what's going to happen. You're going to kill the snail, and you will go back to the overworld. It's a fun little troll cave that isn't trying to be deep or complex. It's a way to give the players a laugh and stretch the assets that From Software made. So it's time for me to ignite some spicy drama. Throughout my time with Elden Ring, I have tried to complement the game on having high quality assets, even if they are seen multiple times. I think pretty much every single enemy is pretty good. I just don't love all of them. Well, the high quality part is true, but Vike feels like he's missing something. He feels unfinished. My conspiracy theory is that his poise is intentionally supposed to be pretty much nothing. Did From Software know this guy wasn't interesting to fight, so they practically made him a dummy that would die in just a few hits and had no chance to fight back? I don't know, truly. What I do know is that this is practically the first time I've ever fought this guy. Every other time I no doubt went into his arena and mollywopped him. He mainly stands around and attempts to poke you with his spear. It's also extremely easy to walk behind him and backstab punish him like you would do in the first Dark Souls 1 game. And because of this, I think I have to say he is the weakest enemy in Elden Ring. He looks like he will put up a fight, but he ultimately doesn't do much of anything. And here we are, our last Deathrite bird in the base game of Elden Ring. These birds and I have never gotten along, and I must say this is probably the hardest bird in the game. The birds are one of the fastest moving enemies in Elden Ring, and when you add the plethora of attacks and overall speed that this guy has onto his high damage, it's inevitable that you will get fucked up. Just look at how much damage I take when I stand in his fire that he spits on the ground. That to me looks just a bit overtuned, but the severity of his balance is not obtrusive. He's not mandatory. You can find runes from easier sources. He's just a hard challenge that will throw you off, and I'm okay with that. I think it is a bit odd though, because he feels really overtuned here, but again, it doesn't really bother me. I thought it was kind of fun. Something that may be easy to forget is that difficulty is going to differ from person to person. What someone finds infuriatingly challenging is what the next person found to be a walk in the park. I think that's true, but the sentiment surrounding Niall is that he's one of the harder fights in the game. Every time I hear someone talk about him, I can almost see them gesticulating about how much they truly hate this guy. I have a friend that only does dex builds because he's inferior, duh, but he absolutely hates this guy. And I have to say that I have never had an issue with Niall because of my build. I'm pretty sure strength builds are Miyazaki's favorite, and if that is true, I wouldn't be surprised if that's why strength builds are always so strong in his games. And my build completely shreds a lot of Elden Ring enemies and mini-bosses, Niall and his ads included. If you are not doing some sort of strength or one-shot mage build for this guy, then I assume he's just infuriating as hell. Strength players can focus on one ad and stunlock that ad to death and move on to the next ad. Dex builds simply don't have this passive boon that will carry them through the fight. They have to suffer. And when I try to view this fight through that lens of a non-strength build player, it's pretty miserable. In fact, most of Elden Ring would probably feel a lot worse without the ability to negate most of the bullshit that is in this game. It is not hard to get bursted down by these 3 ads, and if you are struggling with this encounter, you will eventually get worn down. I think the commander fight in Caelid was a lot less offensive since you had Torrent for the extra mobility, and all around his ads were just weaker ads, but he had more. The boss by himself though is quite good, it's just that he has too much bullshit in his arena. I actually really enjoyed my time fighting him, the weapon he uses, his animations, and I love his downward kick, it's all there. Again, Elden Ring has really high quality assets, but I fail to see why the ads needed to be this strong. If the answer is summoning, then I disagree with the sentiment, but we'll talk about that soon. There are items to negate his summons, but I don't think Elden Ring really teaches the player about niche items that well. Instead, I think FromSoft needed to use them again, and they used these summons to make him feel unique. It works for me, as I have never had an issue with this guy, but I know this encounter has single-handedly made players overfill with rage because of how fast they were killed and how long they were really stuck here. So in short, I think a different summon could have been used here for everyone's sake. I'm not exactly sure if the perfect boss exists, and I like some bosses with obvious flaws more than Mohg himself, but damn. I must say that Mohg is one of the closest bosses From Software has made to being perfect. He is cinematic. He's the perfect challenge, and he has one of the most banger-ass OSTs in this game. I think that he's one of the most fun bosses From Software has really all-around designed, and I love a few things that he does, yes, including his mid-phase transition that we will talk about. I haven't really talked about the music in Elden Ring up until now, and I have a pretty good reason for that. I can tell you why I like certain bosses or levels, but I can't really tell you why I like certain music, whether that be in-game original soundtracks or music I listen to while I'm doing other tasks in real life. I kind of just like the music, and I don't know why. So understand that my next statement is that of someone who ignores and is very ignorant to the art of music. I don't really love Elden Ring's soundtrack when compared to the other games. I think Shadow of the Erdtree introduced some cool music, but I was left with peculiar thoughts as to why I am not in love with Elden Ring's music. That's not to suggest that it's bad. In fact, I think the open world music is really tuneful and even melodious. But with Elden Ring's OST within the boss fights, I have always been somewhat let down. But Mohg has one of my all-time favorite From Software OSTs. His soundtrack is actually so good that I will listen to it from time to time when I'm not playing the game. So anyway, I've already overstepped my comfort zone with music. Let's talk about why Mohg works so well. Mohg's first phase is, well, it's pretty simple. He doesn't do anything that's over the top in terms of what Elden Ring has standardized. He is the classic big dude that hits slow and hard. We've seen what he is doing before, and his first phase may even be too slow for me, but as you fight him, you'll notice that something is kind of off. He will place red rings around your body and chant in a language that you do not understand. Every Elden Ring player understands what it is now, but when I saw this for the very first time, I didn't notice those red things, and I was admittedly somewhat disappointed with his first phase, as I had fought him in the catacomb not long ago. But when I saw this, I was flabbergasted. I was blown away with how cool and cinematic that was. So, to say the least, I really love the Nihil transition. But I must admit that another player may feel jaded by this point in the game, and they feel that this phase transition is simply bullshit. I'm not here to argue with them, but I think that it's pretty awesome. So I think it's so cool and so epic that I would never use the item that you can use to negate most of the damage that he forces upon you. The reason I wouldn't do that is simply because I feel like Nihil is an integral piece of Mohg, and removing the forced damage that he will do would ruin the boss fight for me. So I've made it pretty clear that I like Nihil, and this is where I must admit that I made an oopsie daisy earlier in the video when I said this. And while I do think that every move should be reliably dodgeable without something like a frame perfect dodge, that's what I said, and I think that statement is true most of the time, except with Mohg. It's true at least 99% of the time, as I am okay with the forced damage that is his phase transition. Even if someone can burst him down before he does his Nihil, I will simply just reduce what Nihil is to be forced and guaranteed damage, so we're all on the same page. Nihil is not just a cool cinematic transition, it's more than that. It's that Mohg would be a lot less fun without the pressure he exerts because of it. When you are not using the special tier, you are going to have to chug 3 Estus flasks, and that by itself will make the fight way harder. It's one of the most unique things From Software has done in a fight to me personally. And the more I mull on this, the more I can't recall something that is on paper, cheap, and maybe just a bit bullshit, but at the same time, so fucking cool. Another choice that was made with Mohg is for him to heal roughly a third of his health from Nihil, and if he didn't do that, I feel that it would be all for nothing and not take full advantage of his second half, which does a lot right. Something that I feel like Elden Ring doesn't really require players to do that often is proper positioning in a boss fight. The most challenging duel fights require this, as you need to be in the right place to take full advantage of whatever openings that you have to attack. And with Mohg spewing his blood throughout the boss arena, it forces you to have excellent positioning. And when I fight Mohg, I can't help but think that there wasn't enough of this in the game itself. From Software really leaned into bosses being mechanically interesting, and sometimes they forgot about other forms of difficulty, such as good positioning. Simply put, it's a form of difficulty that I probably enjoy more than the average person. And to continue what I said earlier, I'm glad he heals during his transition because I am forced to use my own healing, which forces players to use their healing wisely. It's a really good system, and the more I write about Mohg, the more I love him. Well, let's talk about his difficulty and one small thing that I think From Software could have done. I struggled hard with Mohg, and when I mull back to my first playthrough, I think that the only other boss that gave me a harder challenge was Malenia. Mohg's challenge was the classic From Software challenge where I wasn't frustrated and I was enjoying getting my ass kicked. I like to lose when things simply aren't unfair. The only suggestion that I have with Mohg would be to make his tier negate 100% of his Nihil damage. I've never used it, but I've seen it used in videos, and it seems like it removes close to all of the damage. I'm sure challenge runners or no-hit runners would have really appreciated this little change. Or not, I don't know, I don't do those type of challenges. My final thoughts on Mohg are two things. One, if Mohg had a cutscene that I enjoy more, and maybe a more stylish boss arena, I think he could probably be in my top 5 favorite bosses. And two, I think Mohg is the epitome of an on-paper bullshit enemy that doesn't feel bad to play against. As we talked about with Godrick, I think bullshit is usually good. It makes an enemy feel like a prominent figure in the world. If every enemy was balanced and fair, it would be way harder to make things cool, if even possible at all. I think Mohg's chaoticness is what makes him fun, and he may be the best boss in the Souls combat system that takes advantage of chaotic, but also fun. So, the big issue that I have with Loretta isn't really her fault. For one, I think she's the best mounted fight in the entire game. And I need to quickly say that I have not refought Gaius as I write this, but I don't remember loving him in Shadow of the Erdtree. But I do have to say that Loretta all around has enough damage to put up a pretty good fight. I like the spells she can do, and I think she's an all around pretty good encounter. So now that I've said all that out loud, she isn't a Runebear or Remembrance boss, but she's like one of the best fights in the game. I'd even say she's the best boss in the Erdtree. The main issue that I have with her is that I enjoy her so much, but getting to her is an all-around pain. And And with how large Elden Ring actually is and how much I actually do enjoy Loretta, I've actually had a lot more strong thoughts that Elden Ring should have had a boss replay mode, similar to Sekiro. And this is why I can see someone saying that Elden Ring's reuse is bad. If someone simply does not want to go around in the open world, treating it as a wonderful canvas, but get through it as fast as possible, then I think their overall argument holds up. And that statement is even further exasperated when we get around to Shadow of the Erdtree. Oddly enough, I think she does right what Mohg did wrong. Like I said when we were talking about Mohg, I had already fought Mohg the Omen right before I got around to the real Mohg, so I was somewhat bored of his first phase when I was fighting him. Loretta, however, was used so long ago that it's almost like you are fighting her again by the time you get here. And that's even if you get here, since getting to the Halo Tree isn't an easy task. The only thing that really throws me off with her is this spell she has in phase 2. It's an easy dodge, so even if it is a bit overtuned, I can live with it. But by God, this thing bursts me down so quickly. Is it overtuned? I don't know. Maybe. It kind of looks overtuned, but what do I know? And even if it is, I think that's okay because it's an easy dodge, and not something stupid like the next Halo Tree boss we will be talking about. Overall, Loretta is the last example that I have in the base game that demonstrates how far From Software has come. I would consider her an all-around A-tier boss if you made me rank her, maybe even very high B, but I think A is a pretty solid fight. And yet, she is better than most of the Dark Souls 1 bosses. Wonderful work From Software. Wonderful work. And I hope more people can see how far they've come with their craft. Something that makes art fun as a whole, including video games, movies, TV shows, novels, whatever you really like to think of here, is that it can show drastic changes in your opinions. Think of a game that you once hated, but after a few years you end up really liking the game. That right there for me is Red Dead 2, in case you're wondering. Anyway, I went into the Fire Giant thinking that I would have the all-around same thoughts that I've had ever since Elden Ring came out, which was more or less completely negative, and I left liking him more than what I did on my previous playthroughs. That's not to suggest that I love him or even like him, because I really don't. Rather, I think he's just fine. The thing with the Fire Giant is that I think his issues are displayed on full view, and it's hard to deny his biggest flaw, the camera. He is one of, if not the biggest enemy in the entire game, and don't forget, this is Elden Ring, 2 games shoved into one, and this guy is the biggest enemy that I can think of. He is just so big that it's hard to see what's really going on most of the time because of his sheer size. Camera issues in the Soulsborne games such as this are more offensive as From Software continues to refine their craft. It's like seeing someone make the same mistake over and over again. At some point, it just becomes tiring and the joke isn't funny anymore. What I really think happened with the Fire Giant is that From Software designed him to be as big as he is, liked what they did with him, and they kind of just let him be. Camera issues be damned. And I think that when you are fighting the Fire Giant without Torrent, the camera issues are more frustrating as he's moving around at such a high pace that it can be hard to keep up with what he's doing. So, more or less what I'm saying is that I think fighting him on Torrent is the best way to take him on. That may sound obvious to some, and if this playthrough has taught me anything, it's that Torrent is more valuable than I gave him credit for. I would still like to say it's not entirely a player's fault that they don't utilize Torrent as much as they should, mainly because he limits your tools and he has no iframes. Also, everything that I've covered before. I fought him multiple times for this video, and while I was on Torrent, I was able to outspace him, or at the very least keep up with his pace, and being on Torrent slightly zooms out the camera to make everything fit more neatly. These little perks made the fight feel better as a whole, and seeing what he was doing was a lot easier. Fighting him without Torrent gave me deja vu as I was having all of the same issues that I thought I had during my other playthroughs. Simply put, Torrent is the key, and he's also king. Even though I have warmed up to the Fire Giant, when I am fighting him in a way that feels better to me, I still think he has good spectacle, and, well, I guess that's kind of it. If a Dark Souls 1 boss has good spectacle but bad mechanics, I would say it was a good attempt, and it would be one of the better bosses in that game. With Elden Ring though, I'm not left that impressed. So I've been pretty open about my deep hatred for the Godskin duo, and there's a general attitude that I have with what I would consider bad content in a video game. So let's put that into perspective for you. Think of a game that had potential, and it took a pretty decent shot, but it struck out. Something where you can see the vision, but whether it was a lack of time, talent, money, really whatever it is, the project didn't turn out the way it was supposed to. If I were to review something such as that, and I can see the genuine hard work and effort that was put into something, I would criticize the game, but I would do it as nicely as I possibly can. On the opposite side of this example, you have some unenjoyable content that clearly didn't take a shot. Think of Fallout 76. What I just described, though, would be the Godskin duo. I think that Godskin duo doesn't take any shots, and is nothing more than a filler boss for From Software to reuse some assets. I'm not going to pretend like I know better than From Software because, well, I don't. But with how many times Elden Ring reused these Godskin enemies, I would have thought that it would have been plenty to justify their overall existence. We fight them in catacombs, individual fights, and so on. So this piss poor reuse here doesn't really make sense to me. Not only that, but Elden Ring is not a game that needed to add a few filler boss fights to extend its playtime. Elden Ring is one of the biggest games that I've ever played. This game is filled with content, so getting your value is not hard. If I grabbed Dark Souls 1 for just a moment, I would have expressed my distaste for a filler boss, but I ultimately do understand that the Souls formula was still new to From Software, and Dark Souls 1 is not an open world game, so having to stretch a few extra hours of game time with needless runbacks or a bad boss is annoying, but for its time and what it was doing, very understandable. And with that out of the way, Godskin Duo is a mistake, and I don't think any issue is saying it so bluntly and rude because I view it as nothing more than a complete waste of time and a lazy reuse. There are a few big issues that I have with Godskin Duo. For one, if these guys were shoved into a catacomb, I'd probably say that they are kind of bad, but I like them. Very similar to my thoughts on the Duo Crucible Knight catacomb. I have talked extensively about reuse in this video, and by this point you understand my stance on it, and you also understand that I like duo bosses. A lot. Like a lot. Where my underlying hatred resides is that Godskin Duo is the death of good duo bosses. Elden Ring hit the mark on a lot of things, and yeah, I mean a lot. It has one of the best open worlds that I've ever played. It looks good at every single angle. It has a lot of good bosses, but I like duo bosses. I really like duo bosses. Not this trash though. Not at all. Ornstein and Smo, Ringed City, hell, even Dark Liquors from Dark Souls 2 is my jam. I can bathe in these bosses for hours, and I loathe everything that Godskin Duo is. In general, you should know that I'm a bit of a tilter. When I first fought the Godskin Duo, I was somewhat excited. I was waiting for a good duo boss, and maybe those expectations are asking too much, because in all reality, how can I really ask for more from Elden Ring? Elden Ring in general is just such a masterpiece of a game that it would be like asking for an extra gift on one of the best Christmases you've ever had. It would be kind of rude, honestly. I acknowledge that, but I still have not reconciled my overall disgust for this boss, and I don't think I ever will. Godskin Duo doesn't take any shots. At its core, it's two reused assets haphazardly shoved into one boss arena. It's not good, it's not fun, and it's most certainly not entertaining. My tinfoil hat theory for why these two are so bad is somewhat embarrassing. Let me just edge into it. Elden Ring is From Software's hardest game if you are not summoning and not using an overpowered build. I most certainly know there are a lot of ands in that statement to make it work, but these ands aren't rare or uncommon to see. The bosses in Elden Ring generally are not well designed to work when they have multiple targets to focus on, and there are a lot of players that simply do not find it fun to melt the boss. If you do one of those things, or even both, hey, that's fine, you do you. But as a whole, Elden Ring wants you to summon. Not summoning is a needless challenge run, and I think From Software probably had the intention of summoning in mind with this game since summons are so powerful and much more interesting than the past games. So, now that I have properly set up my argument, why would From Software design a duo boss with moves that flow together like a work of art if people are going to summon and take away from the fun? It's a hard question to answer, and FromSoft is known to design content that many won't experience. But if they were to design this cool duo boss just for a sizable amount of players to not really experience it in the quote-unquote intended way, why would they bother? I don't know if this theory is even remotely close to the bullseye, as the simple answer is usually the correct answer, but maybe they also just didn't have time to design a complex duo boss. It's not even offensive or wrong if this is the answer, but I do think it's an overall disrespect to the player's time to force this boss upon them, even if they can overpower themselves and pound them into the dirt. It is not good regardless of how easy it can be made, and for that, I am considering Godskin Duo the worst boss in the entire game, and possibly the most offensive boss From Software has ever created. This is almost as low as some of the runbacks in the Dark Souls 2 DLC. And if we never see a good duo boss in the Souls combat system again, this series will have lost something that I held so close to me. Alright, so we're finally here, and this has been a long time coming, and I can finally talk about Malenia. In pretty much every single video that I have been talking about the From Software bosses, I have been getting a fair share of Malenia hate in. And, well, the thing is, Malenia is the kind of boss that you can predict everything that the other person is going to say as soon as they say whether they like the fight or not. If someone were to say that they do like Malenia, then, well, everything will kind of fall into place. And most likely everything she does kind of just clicks with the other person. I don't even need to read every Malenia lover's comment. They'll probably say things like, oh, well, she's the hardest boss in the game, and I like the challenge. She has a long fight that will test your mental endurance, and maybe they even like waterfowl. But if someone says that they don't like Malenia as a fight, you'll hear a few skill issue arguments, because why would you not? And the rest will naturally fall into place. They don't like waterfowl, they don't like her heal, and a few other things that don't really matter right now. Simply put, Malenia is one of the most contentious bosses in Elden Ring by a landslide. She was just so contentious that you couldn't even go outside in real life and not hear someone talking about waterfowl because of the amount of attention that she has received. So let's peel this bandage off. I fucking hate Malenia. I don't think she's that great of a fight, and I think that waterfowl ruins 90% of what she does. There. I said it. If you think that someone not liking Malenia is a skill issue, then I'm not here to argue with you. Because as I have played through these games back to back, I have had a few of my opinions change, such as the Nameless King in Dark Souls 3 for really whatever reason I'm not sure, but I wasn't really a fan of him prior to my last playthrough. Now, I think he's one of my favorite bosses in Dark Souls 3. Funny how that works. Malenia, however, will never not have a Waterfowl dance, one of the worst moves in the entire game. But Waterfowl is only one move and she has an entire kit to talk about, so let's get to that later. The second that you start fighting Malenia, you will quickly learn that she isn't there to play around, and that she'll be one of the hardest bosses in Elden Ring. On paper, she has, well, almost everything. It's not like her HP is laughably low, such as Morgott. She has her heal to double dip on mistakes that you make. You take damage, and she heals. She's fast, multiple combos, and even when she's not doing Waterfowl, she has a few moves that will undeniably throw you off the initial few times you see it, and yes, of course, Waterfowl. These are all just Phase 1 designs. None of this is to mention all of the extras that she will get in Phase 2. Simply put, Malenia is designed with lots in her kit. Having a complex kit is not a bad thing. I wouldn't argue she's more mechanically complex than Blasudasax or Godrick, but she's not a simple boss, even without Waterfowl. She has a lot going on. A lot going on is one thing. She has some cool stuff, but Waterfowl is where it all goes crashing down for me. Oh, Waterfowl. You have been talked about to death by this point, and there's absolutely nothing that I can do or say that will make you agree with me if you currently disagree with me. I think that Waterfowl ruins the fight, and I also think it's a terrible move. So, where does one start with the Waterfowl discussion? That's a big topic. There are so many layers and levels to this move that the only way I could think of dissecting what issues I have with this move is to quite literally look at my notes and go down the list. Here are my issues with Waterfowl. It is too hard to dodge when you don't know how to deal with it, such as guides on YouTube. It's not fun to play around, and when you do understand how to deal with Waterfowl, it isn't a fun or rewarding experience. I disagree with most of the counterpoints that people will say to defend it, and many more. These are going to be most of my core arguments with Waterfowl, and then we'll talk about whatever is left with her. And if there is one unique thing I can say about Waterfowl, is that if I could go back in time, go to From Software's office, and personally tell Miyazaki himself to not put Waterfowl in Malenia's kit, I wouldn't. I think that the design isn't something that I like, but I am glad they made the move as odd as that sounds. Plus, why do I get to intrude with their art? That's not very nice. So the main issue that I have with Waterfowl is that it's simply too hard to deal with, and tackling the TD Sass move will become grating. If you are playing Elden Ring as blind as you possibly can, you will come across Waterfowl and die and die and die and die again. It's not an easy move to deal with, and it's especially hard for melee players when you are in melee range. Oh, now I can already hear some of the comments, but Elden Ring is supposed to be hard, and you're supposed to die. That's the whole point of the game. How have you played Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and you don't understand this? Well, I do. Trust me, but dying to Waterfowl isn't a fun and engaging task like how dying to Bale is or Mesmir. Dying to Waterfowl is just annoying. But anyway, going on with how hard Waterfowl is for melee players, I would say that it is so hard for melee players to dodge Waterfowl when you are in melee range. I'd even go as far to say that there is not an intended way to keyword dodge Waterfowl at a close distance. You cannot convince me that From Software intended for players to 360 ring around the rosy Malenia when she starts up Waterfowl. No other boss up to this point in the entire series has required you to do that. At least not one that I can think of, and I'm certain that there isn't one. Really, the best way to deal with Waterfowl is to bang your head against a wall, die to one single move repeatedly, and simply just capitulate your aggression because there's no point in getting mad at this bullshit ass move. Unless you somehow decipher the art of 360 no-scope, the best way to deal with Waterfowl without a very specific Ash of War is to play as passively as possible when you have taken out roughly 50% of her HP. That is not fun. Having to sit back and wait for her to do one move is boring. Waiting is boring, and that's what I had to do to beat Waterfowl. A boss taking control of the tempo with really aggressive moves, such as Morgott, is usually fun. It's fun to have to dodge countless moves and attacks and play the defensive game. What I don't like is dying to a move for hours on end, and going against my intuitions by simply not playing the game and letting the game have fun is just really lame. But that's just my experience with Waterfowl. There are ways to deal with this move, and me not mentioning those ways would be kind of wrong to not mention. For one, you can use an Ash of War that will give you some sort of dash that will make dodging Waterfowl a lot easier. But I have to also say that there are some issues that I have with this argument. For one, Elden Ring has a lot of cool weapons, and I like to use some of those cool weapons. On my first playthrough of Elden Ring, the blind playthrough where I tried to not use a guide and any outside help, I was using the Grafted Blade Greatsword, a weapon that cannot change its L2 ability because it has a special one. Maybe I was pigeonholing myself into one weapon, but I also didn't know about these special Ashes of War, and there was essentially no way that I would have tried every Ash of War that I may or may have not had just for one move. Even if someone wants to make the argument, well, Bloodhound Step exists for a reason, this is an RPG, not Sekiro. If the go-to argument is to use a very specific Ash of War that happens to make this one move feel viable to deal with, that feels like it negates one of Elden Ring's selling points, which is play how you like and do what you like, because the amount of builds and weapons in this game is, quite frankly, astounding. Speaking of very specific playstyles, shield users surely were confused with how Waterfowl interacts with their shield, I'm sure. There's nothing wrong with a boss being weaker to certain playstyles and even stronger against certain playstyles. Moog, for example, is notorious for being harder for melee, but being a bit of a pushover for magic users. But Malenia is the only boss that makes using a shield feel kind of awkward and maybe even like you're playing the game wrong for some people. I don't know what made From Software decide that Malenia healing when she doesn't do damage was going to be fun for all builds, but they did. Shields are a strong addition to your build that comes with a downside, and it's quite obvious. You will be one-handing your main weapon. Elden Ring, to me at least, feels the strongest when you are using something in both hands, but of course Malenia simply does not care and will make your shield feel useless, almost like From Software is nearly killing the shield playstyle. Although what I just said is not entirely true, but it sometimes feels like it. When I was initially struggling on Malenia, I attempted to use a shield. I don't normally use shields, and my asinine logic was that a shield would do well here, but of course, it didn't. So, when I quickly learned that using a shield will cause her to heal, I called bullshit and went back to what I was comfortable with. Again, this is me relaying my experience to you, which happened over 3 years ago. And while I do think that her healing on a shield is a questionable decision, using a shield to block Waterfowl, as much as I hate to admit it, feels kind of like the intended experience. Or at least an intended way to deal with Waterfowl. If there is one good design around Waterfowl, it's that it takes some time to wind up so you have time to react to it. When you do use a shield to negate Waterfowl, playing a bit slower is the key. I have enough time to pull out my shield, react to her jumping in the air, and block it with my 100% shield. Obviously, I cannot walk up to Miyazaki and say, hey, was this the intended experience? But my guess is that it most likely was. The conclusion that I have with Waterfowl is that the solving puzzle element of it can be fun. We all like games such as The Witness or Humanity because solving puzzles is fun, but solving the Waterfowl puzzle just wasn't fun to me. It was just a huge waste of time. It simply was not fun for me to die to this one move over and over again. And because of my very overdone Waterfowl section, I will quickly summarize my last few Waterfowl talking points because the move is so unfun for me to talk about and deal with that I've had my fill talking about it. The TLDR for just use items such as the Freezing Pot is that Elden Ring is filled with many craftable items very similar to the Ashes of War, and the Freezing Pot is simply too specific, and finding out this completely negates Waterfowl isn't something that the average player will do. Plus, crafting in Elden Ring is something that I don't hear anyone talking about, so I have to assume that it's not used that often. Sekiro simply succeeds where Elden Ring failed with this. Without showing any footage to not spoil, again, this is going to be somewhat light spoilers here, the bad ending in Sekiro has a very powerful move that the boss will do where he will charge up a move that's almost familiar to Waterfowl, and the Firecracker prosthetic arm completely negates it. The thing is, Sekiro always nudged and directly told you that Firecrackers are overpowered as hell, quite frankly. Plus, there's only a handful of prosthetic arms in Sekiro, so experimenting with them isn't nearly as annoying as it is in Elden Ring. There. I could say a lot more about Waterfowl, but I won't. I'm done with it. I fucking hate Waterfowl, and if that makes me bad at the game, then have fun in the comment section saying get good and I'll take it all. But just like how there is more to Elden Ring that's not the levels and bosses, there is more to Malenia that is not Waterfowl, and I do want to touch up on the other things that she can do. I think that her heal is a design that I'm not against, but it can quickly become frustrating. Making a few bad mistakes back to back will cause her to heal a significant amount of HP, and seeing those mistakes pile on top of each other can be daunting to some. I like punishing elements such as this. It's part of why I was addicted to League of Legends for 5 years, and I'm not opposed to it. I also think that she has some fun bullshit in her kit that I enjoy. In phase 2, she will float in the air and throw 5 or 6 spirit summons at you. I think it's unfair, but yeah, dodging these spirits is fun to me, even if there is absolutely nothing I can do as a melee player while she is AFK in the air. And lastly, I think her overall tempo is a welcome change to Elden Ring. There are times when it feels like she is in more control of the fight when Waterfowl is on cooldown. Having to abide by the boss's strengths and play slow but confident is fun to me. I think one of the better tactics that I do is to play slow and and not charge in with too much aggression and rely on hit trading. It forces my strength brain to twist and not solely rely on hit trading. It's a welcome change. And to cap off Malenia, I think that she was designed well even if I do not like her. I tried to be fair with my criticisms and say them as nicely as I could because there was genuine effort put into Malenia, and she's not some shitty filler boss such as the Godskin duo. If From Software designed Waterfowl to be as oppressive as possible and force players to lean into the RPG side of Elden Ring with certain Ashes of War or other abilities, then I don't really think that's a direction that I would enjoy for future games, but not every game is going to be designed for me. Learning how to deal with Waterfowl without those abilities is a miserable ass experience, and if we get more bosses like what I am saying, where they are just so oppressive that you have to alter your build, then the series might be moving in a direction that I don't like. That might even be Armored Core. I don't know, I didn't beat Armored Core. We'll probably talk about that with Radahn too. And lastly, this is somewhat off topic with Malenia, but since she is the hardest boss in the base game, I think it's fitting enough. There is bound to be a handful of get good comments in the comment section, and it's fine if those are commented. I don't really care, but I think that the get good saying is outdated by this point. Outdated may not be the best word, but when I see someone else saying get good in other people's comment sections, that's not my own. The get good comments are always used when they simply disagree with the other person, and they disregard whatever they are saying. Let me just say this. If you can beat Malenia or Radahn 2 or Plasudasax, you're good at the game. You are at some of the hardest bosses in the base game, bosses that are way harder than your average Dark Souls 3 boss. So because of that, you are good at the game, and almost every get good comment that I see, I dislike because it feels like someone isn't willing to listen to someone criticize the precious From Software. If you are here and you have beaten Malenia, great job. I believe that you are good at the game. So yeah, Malenia definitely is not my favorite From Software boss, but ultimately she is a boss that I can accept. And with Malenia done, we are going to wrap up the last few base game bosses in Elden Ring. There's been a lot, and Mountaintops doesn't really add a ton of new Catacomb bosses or overworld enemies, so I am going to try and end the discussion of the base game reuse with this boss here. Mountaintops is notorious for adding nothing or close to nothing, and being one of the worst areas in the game, including the DLC. In general, snowy areas and open worlds don't really do it for me, and with Mountaintops not having much, I kind of hate this area utterly and completely. What I will say is that Elden Ring is my favorite From Software game, even with the flaws, and if the product itself needed Mountaintops to get the last stretch of assets for product viability, then, well, I guess I have to begrudgingly accept it, don't I? Because by the time you get here, Putrid Avatar has probably been killed half a dozen times, and the enemy itself wasn't all that special in Dark Souls 1, so it's definitely not special here. Something that most Catacombs fail to do is convey the joy of exploration that Elden Ring is known for. Not only is the open world a joy to explore on your first few playthroughs, but the level design of Elden Ring is quite good too. For the most part, Catacombs lack the joy of fun, level exploration, and are just simple combat challenges that we have seen before. The Catacomb with the Stray Mimic tier, however, is the opposite of this and offers fun exploration in a base game Catacomb. If there does happen to be some leftover Elden Ring content that has not been done yet, it's probably a Catacomb. And I must say, I did not know this Catacomb existed, and this was my first time doing it. So, because of that, I kind of had a lot of fun doing this Catacomb. The overall obscure nature of this Catacomb was exciting to me, and the base game Catacombs don't offer this for the most part. The actual boss at the end isn't anything special, but I think that's okay because of the joy I got before the boss itself. And since I would argue this is one of the most unique Catacombs in Elden Ring's base game with its unique level design, I think that it's safe for me to say that this is probably the best Catacomb that's not in Shadow of the Erdtree. A basic Catacomb layout with a reused boss is forgettable, but the Stray Mimic tier fight won't be forgotten anytime soon. The Estelle rematch that resides in the end of Elden Ring encapsulates almost every issue that the base game has, and it's that the end game isn't as good as the rest of what we played earlier. Reusing assets is one thing, but this Catacomb that Estelle is in isn't particularly interesting like what we just saw with the Stray Mimic tier. You fall down some terrain and you are basically done. For people that didn't do the main Estelle fight, it could be nice for them to experience something brand new, as doing another playthrough just for one boss can be a tough ask, but it's still a rematch in a boring Catacomb. We just came off of one of the best base game Catacombs just to find yourself in one of the worst Catacombs. I don't think much, if anything, was changed besides some number tweaks for a more appropriate late game encounter. Estelle is still fine, I guess, but there's nothing outstanding or wrong with the moves he does. However, it just feels a bit out of place here, and his boss arena was a welcome addition to enhance the flavor of his main encounter. And with this being our last Grave Warden fights, I must say that they never lost their novelty for me, and I can still fight a few to this day and not complain. I would have appreciated more health on this guy, as his damage feels pretty high, but high in a way that's fun for me because of the mistakes that I knew I couldn't make. Something that I like most with the Grave Warden is his overall aesthetic design. I think this is the perfected design for this enemy, and he finally looks like a menacing enemy in the lands between. When you are fighting him in Limgrave, his design feels almost out of place, and he would be fitting for a more gladiator design. So yeah, he's good, and I didn't really appreciate him until this playthrough because of how fast I would slaughter him. From Software, I ask you to make Catacombs slightly harder in your future open worlds. Please. The only real conclusion that I have with the Ancient Hero enemies is that they are one of my favorite enemies to fight, and I can't put my finger on the exact reasons behind that statement. On paper, they are just another Elden Ring enemy. They have a few moves that aren't anything special, and even a second phase. However, I still like them a lot, and I would say that I even enjoy them more with the Grave Warden Duelist enemies that are seen throughout Elden Ring. The only thing that I would have liked to see in the Catacomb version of these enemies is maybe a different aesthetic design, similar to the Grave Warden Duelist that we just fought. In the end of Endgames, Dragonlord Placidusax is my favorite boss. That is the boss rush at the tail end of Elden Ring. If there's one thing Elden Ring definitely nailed, it's that it finally made consistent dragon bosses that are well done. The past Souls games would have a mixed bag of dragons, including Dark Souls 3, mainly because of the one-shot Wyvern boss. Yeah, that was really bad. Not only is Placidusax better than Midir, in my opinion, he's also one of the more unique dragon fights From Software has ever made. He is a good dragon, so that automatically makes him unique in my book, but a lot of dragon enemies want you to fight them head-on and attack their head. Bale does, Midir does, and so does the endless amount of field dragons that are in the base game of Elden Ring. Placidusax takes a different approach where you will rarely be attacking his head, and you will eventually opt for hitting his tail or the side of his body. This design works with what he's doing as well. Large and beefy dragons in the Soulsborne games are usually made with fire attacks and a lot of vicious chomps with their mouths. You can even throw in some claw swipes. Those are great and usually work very well for what a dragon is going for. Placidusax, though, keeps his unique identity by not following the expected. He does have claw swipes and fire attacks, but he almost has no attacks that are trying to bite a chunk of your flesh. Instead, From Software had him control the lightning that surrounds his arena, and because of that, he has one of the most unique kits in the entirety of Soulsborne because you have to rely on the visual cues that are flashing red, lights that will warn you where his lightning will land. There may be other bosses that have something similar to this, but Placidusax embodies this and it's a core aspect of what he does. Since From Software designed him to not rely on the expectation of what a dragon should be, his first phase is more timid, and it's all about ramping up to his second phase, and if there is one complaint I can understand someone having with Placidusax, it's that phase 1 is an overall slower pace that's ramping up to the real fight, because phase 2 is what makes a dragon fight memorable, and that is of course the spectacle. Let's not forget that From Software deliberately chose to damage Kalameet's wing in Dark Souls 1, and we didn't have our first cool dragon fight that flies around until Dark Souls 2, and yet again Elden Ring's dragons have the best flying spectacle when compared to their other games. Even Sin in Dark Souls 2 looks a bit jank when he's in the air. I don't know, it's just how it looks to me at least. Midir looked fine, but Bale and Placidusax take the cake on looking stylish and being a good fight simultaneously. Elden Ring really doesn't get enough credit for stepping up the dragon game, and honestly probably the animations that From Software does as a whole. Phase 2 is when you get the huh moment because he completely vanishes and comes flying down in a blaze of glory just like a badass dragon should. That's all without mentioning the high of dodging his attacks versus the flying dragon from the sky that's out to kill you, because yeah, he is out to kill you. The overall aggression is turned up here, and From Software even made him less docile since he will attack and sometimes do a Dragon Ball Z vanish after some of his attacks. I think that it's pretty stylish and looks really good. Even though Placidusax isn't my favorite From Software dragon, I would say he's the best dragon when judged by the sum of his parts. He has the best dragon boss arena, the best cutscene, he doesn't just rely on the expected from a dragon boss fight, and the rest of what he does is overall top tier. Although I like Bale a lot more just because he's so action-packed and over the top. I'm going to have to swallow my pride here and say that I was sleeping on him for a long time. I have my reasons for why I was doing that, but for the longest time I thought Midir was a better dragon fight, and I no longer stand by that statement. The endgame of Elden Ring was uniquely disappointing for me, and if you've been following along with this video, then you probably can understand why at least. I wasn't getting my duo boss, I don't like snowy areas in video games, and I fucking hate his runback. I was just so annoyed at his runback that I was leaning too heavily on that criticism, and I have to just defend myself. Don't get me wrong, runbacks should no longer exist in the Soulsborne games, and yes, I am petty, so I timed how long his runback actually is, and it's about 100 seconds of pure time-wasting bullshit. I won't rant about that for long, at least I hope I won't, but whoever From Software keeps giving these dragon bosses tedious-ass runbacks needs to have a stern talking to for being so flippant with people's time. We like losing in a From Software game. We do not like wasting time on tedious bullshit. And the last thing I want to quickly say about Plasudasax is that he has the perfect balance in Elden Ring. He has attacks with a lot of damage, powerful moves that aren't complete BS like Waterfowl, enough health, but not too much that the fight will become miserable, and yeah, I think he's just really good at what he does. And out of the hundreds of bosses in this game, I am going to crown him as the best boss in terms of balance in Elden Ring. The two big bosses in Farum Azula are almost antithetical to each other. The Dragon Lord was more stationary and balanced with proper damage and health. Malekith, however, is one of the most hyper-aggressive enemies in the entire game. If there's one thing Malekith does well, it's that he looks flashy and he does a good job at doing that. Sadly, I can't say that he has more than what I just described. He looks flashy and he's pretty cool looking. Maybe in Dark Souls 1 or 2 that would have been enough, but by this point in the series I don't think it is, and if you can't tell, I don't really care for Malekith. I have always been in my little corner all by myself where I cannot join in on the festivity of this boss. Lots of people will chant and shout that Malekith is one of the best bosses in the game. However, I have never thought that way. Really, I can see pieces of why Malekith is so liked, but instead of intertwining together like a work of art, I am instead left with vacantness. It all starts with Beast Clergyman, and to give credit where credit is due, Malekith twists the expectations of how radical his phase changes are. Most phase changes in the Soulsborne games are natural kit evolutions. Plasudasax is a good example, but unless you knew what was coming, chances are the actual reveal of Malekith was a stark difference from what you were expecting, and that's a really good thing. So I do like the idea of Beast Clergyman, I just don't find him fun to fight. He's pretty basic with a few swipes and rock throws. That's one thing, and I have fought plenty of basic enemies in the Soulsborne games before, but when you end up dying a few times to the real fight, he becomes more of a chore to do than anything else, as the grand finale of Elden Ring is back-to-back bosses, and only fighting these bosses with bloated stats that we'll talk about makes the experience feel entirely jaded for me. Beast Clergyman may feel acceptable to fight on repeat if I enjoyed Malekith even a little bit. The real issues that I have with Malekith aren't really to do with the enjoyment of his actual moves. Elden Ring truly has close to zero enemies that have poor kits to fight and interact with. The balance of these kits, though, is where you can run into some debate. Morgott felt like he had the kit, he had the moves, he just lacked the stats to put up any resemblance of a fight. Malekith has a less interesting kit to interact with, but he definitely has the stats in the damage department at least. He is one of the best examples in Elden Ring of leveling damage but forgetting to level vigor. Simply put, his damage feels way too high, but you can burst him down like you can with Morgott. This is not an oversight from Software. I will not commentate that narrative. No, this was intentional. There is a special sauce here that can work, almost like the empty sections in Shadow of the Erdtree. I think that the empty sections in Shadow of the Erdtree are honestly pretty enjoyable, and I think that the formula that Malekith has can work for me with future bosses. In case you need a refresher on how much damage he really has, I have one of the tankier armor sets in the game and he's still bursting me down. He has close to everything when it comes to damage. He has ranged abilities, he has mobility, making it so melee players can't always attack him, which is a great design. He also has a unique mechanic that will remove some of your HP for a certain amount of time and even drain your HP. In short, he does a lot of damage. This will create a tense pressure where you will inevitably fold under that pressure, and just one or two back-to-back mistakes will completely wipe away your health. It's a great design on paper. I also don't have an issue with his extreme mobility. This harkens all the way back to what I've been saying, in that some BS is a good thing. It just doesn't really work with me because of how squishy he is. Admittedly, this may be a me case where your build really alters how much you enjoy the boss here, but I still think that a flat 15% HP buff would be appropriate here. Now, I can already hear it. Oh, it's stirring like a witch's cauldron in my head. Well, if you think he has enough damage but not enough HP, limit yourself and use a weaker weapon. I don't think anyone is wrong to say that, but I am reviewing these bosses with a normal-ish build and playstyle. This is not a level 1 review, nor is this a review as an overpowered build. This is the experience of someone that is playing the game with some intentional handicaps just because I killed so many bosses that I could have put my character level to around 170 or something if I was not rune dumping. My experience versus Malekith is done with purpose, and it's not to mold my build around the game to make Elden Ring look as good as possible. I may do that for future runs, but that's not the purpose of these boss reviews. There's one more crucial point with Malekith, and it's that the Blasphemous Claw that is designed for his fights. I don't mind special items for bosses, and in case you do not remember, Dark Souls 1's DLC had a special item for that DLC as well. I never used it, I've only seen footage, so just like Moog, I don't necessarily have an issue with this item, but I must say that it's not very intuitable. as a whole. Reading the item tells you pretty clearly that it's an item for this boss fight, but figuring out when to actually use the parry window was not that intuitable to me. I had to look up a guide on when to actually use it properly, and you use it when there's a golden shine on his attacks. With Malekith's high speed and generally having a lot of stuff going on, I don't really think From Software made it something players can piece together. If you do happen to get Mohg's item, then it's not hard to apply his item with success. Malekith is the opposite, and I think that it could have been done a little bit better. So, as a whole, yeah, I don't really like Malekith that much. Yes, he is better than your average Dark Souls 1 and 2 boss, but the Souls games are an iterative series. I don't think saying that a boss such as Malekith being more enjoyable than your average boss from games that are a decade old is much of a compliment. When you come back to Landale for one last Elden Hurrah, Sir Gideon will welcome you with a monologue before he bursts you down with some of the highest damage in the entire game. I usually attack him when I get here, but I decided to be a gentleman and let him speak his piece. And our gentleman's agreement was the death of me more than once. I just got done talking about how I don't enjoy the class canon tendencies of Malekith, but in Gideon's case, however, I think it works here. He's not a boss that most will struggle on unless you're doing a challenge run, and for those who did do an Elden Ring challenge run, like a level 1 challenge run for example, you have my condolences. I've heard he's just really hard. If he is bursting a late game character down as quickly as he did in this footage here, then he no doubt one-shots people who are playing the game at level 1. You may be predicting what I'm about to say in your head. It may sound something like, oh well, I don't like bursty enemies, and he has close to 0 HP, so it's not my kind of thing. And to that I say no. No, I'm not going to say that. Gideon is not supposed to be a quote-unquote main boss that has higher expectations. He's kind of a lore boss with some interesting dialogue that does a good job at splitting up the difficulty. Imagine if we went from Malekith to Godfrey and then Radagon and the Elden Beast. It would be 3 back-to-back super hard endgame fights with little in between to relieve the stress. There is no open world left to explore, there are only hard boss fights. I also like how he showcases a lot of spells that I don't see that often. It's not really common for me to see these spells as I don't PvP, nor do I use ranged builds, so to be honest, I forgot Millennia's Flower Dive was a spell, and seeing that here was a welcome change for me. Gideon is not a deep boss, he's not overly challenging, and that's okay. The grand finale does more than enough of that, so him being here to tie up the storyline is perfectly acceptable in my opinion.